Okay, we're going to start our program with a video from Senator Warner, and it'll be up on these screens on the left and right of the room.
I really wish I could be with you in person, but unfortunately today I'm in Northern Virginia. I did have a chance, though, to be in Southwest Virginia in the last 2 weeks and did have a chance to visit with some of you in this room and really appreciate everybody coming to this important meeting. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge our co-hosts, Dr. Jim Worth and Margaret Tommen from Stone Mountain Health Services. Thanks so much for your generous support. And Dr. Kristen Westover from Mountain Empire Community College. Thank you for allowing us to hold the summit here today. We all know that miners in Central Appalachia have powered America for generations, and they have sacrificed so much to keep the lights on all across America. In fact, as many of you know, the largest cluster of complicated black lung cases have been found in Central Appalachia. This was discovered by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. So, even in 2019, we're seeing so many young miners, folks in their late 30s and early 40s, being diagnosed with complicated black lung. Now, this just isn't right. I think everybody in this room knows that the federal government's commitment to the miners goes back to 1946, when President Truman made a promise to protect miners' retirement and health care benefits, to make sure that we would then honor their hard work and service to our nation. We unfortunately haven't always kept those promises. There are certain things we've done. Currently, as many of you know, the Byrd amendments, which are part of the Affordable Care Act, are helping miners get the benefits they deserve, but we do need to do more. In Washington, I've fought to uphold President Truman's promise by increasing funding for black lung health clinics. Additionally, I've helped increase participation in federal health programs that detect and treat black lung disease amongst coal miners. I've also worked with my colleagues to introduce bills that would extend Black Lung Disability Trust Fund and protect miners' pensions and health care benefits. But there's obviously still more to be done in terms of protecting both health care and particularly the pension benefits. We also know that this problem has gotten worse, unfortunately, because of certain recent bankruptcies. I know there's a lot of miners from Black Jewel in this room who are frankly struggling really hard right now. Let me just say this. Our current bankruptcy laws are unacceptable. We need to change those laws so that workers and pensions are protected and not put at the bottom of the barrel when a company goes into bankruptcy, as they have in the case of Black Jewel. But before I go, and I know you've got folks from my office and others who will soon make presentations, I want to again thank you all for being there, and as miners, for everything you've done for Virginia and for our whole country. I hope this summit provides much needed answers and support. I also trust that you rely on the members of my staff who are with you today to help you in any way we can. Again, there's ways we can fight this legislatively. There's ways we need to fight this in terms of keeping pressure on the coal mining companies to pay their fair share. We've got to make changes in our bankruptcy laws so that workers and their pensions are not put at the bottom of the barrel, but have priority. And we've got to make sure that we continue to do the kind of research that's needed so that complicated black lung does not strike down so many young people as it is unfortunately happening today. I look forward to the results from this summit. And again, if there's any additional ways that I can be of assistance, please don't hesitate to call on me. Many of you in the room know Shane, who's done such a good job representing me in the region, but together we can make black lung a thing in the past. Thank you all so much.
I would like to give a special thank you to my colleagues Shane and Kelly, who have worked their butts off to make this a success along with everyone else in the room. And particularly, I'd like to give a special thank you to Shane, who many of you might know, but one thing that's unique about Shane is that he is a former miner, and he's intimately familiar with these issues, and he has kept me, Craig, the senator, and the rest of our staff very plugged into what's going on, what we can do to help, and making sure that we're being responsive to the concerns of the community here. And that's something that I'm very thankful to him for, and that we're going to continue to use that relationship and his skills and his network as much as possible. So like I said, I do want to give an update from DC, but also after Craig speaks, I think what we would like to hear most importantly is from you all with any questions, concerns, comments, because one thing that we do want to take away today is what we can be doing. I think you heard the senator in his video mention that we do want to be doing more, but a critical part of that is what we can be doing to do more. A big part of that is going to come from hearing from you all and any questions, concerns, or comments that you may have once we're done giving our short updates from DC. The one thing, as you heard the senator mention again, is that we have seen a very, very large increase in instances of black lung and PMF, and particularly complicated black lung, and that's something that we're working as hard as we can to fight. Again, you heard about the Byrd amendments, and that's on the treatment side. That's one success that we've had recently, which was part of the Affordable Care Act, and it ensured that minors who are diagnosed or who are suffering from black lung are able to get their benefits, and that they don't have to go through hurdles, they don't face unfair denials, and so that's an important win that we're focused on continuing to build upon and making sure that we don't take steps back in that area. Another thing that the senator mentioned that we're working on, I'm happy to go in more depth on if you have questions, is we recently successfully passed bipartisan legislation with Senator Kane and Senator Capito from West Virginia. And what that legislation did is it took a very close look at what some of the barriers are to treatment for both active and non-active minors. And we recently got the results of that study, and we're looking forward to pushing some of the findings that we discovered and putting that into legislation. One of the big things that came out of that study is that we found, which many of you may know, is that there are privacy concerns. When you're going in and you're getting a screening, you want to make sure that information is kept private, and that's something that we've worked on in various facets throughout the healthcare system. Whether it's black lung or any type of ailment, your medical information, your healthcare information, you should have full comfortability that no one's going to find out about that, whether it be your employer, friends, family members, and that's something that we'll be working to improve so that there is, a comfort level that when you're getting your health screenings, that no one's going to know about that except for you. Another thing that we discovered is that there's significant barriers in place for non-active minors who are no longer an active minor, and when they want to go get screened, it's very possible for you to develop black lung or PMF even after you're no longer working in the mines, but you don't have access to those same free health screenings that an active minor would. And so that's another item that we'll be working on in the coming year or so, as well as more investments in mobile health units to make sure that it's easier for you to access these screenings. We all have very busy lives, we lead busy lives and have lots to do. It's difficult for me to get to the doctor. I'm sure it's the same for you all, and one of the things that we want to do is make it easier, whether it's mobile health units, telehealth, and that's something that we'll be exploring as well. So once again, thank you for joining us, and my colleague Craig will come up, and after that we're happy to come back up and take any questions or comments that you may have from us.
So as Greg said, thanks for having us. This is really wonderful, so thanks for everyone for putting this on and inviting us down to speak. Greg did a really good job covering some of the work the senator is doing targeted specifically at black lung. I'll talk a little bit about more generally what he's doing on the benefits side, as well as the bankruptcy legislation that he mentioned in the video. And I would just say I have a very personal connection to this. I grew up in not southwestern Virginia, but southwestern Pennsylvania, which was a coal mining county, Fayette County. And so I had a lot of friends and family that worked in the mines that were afflicted with these types of ailments, and I certainly understand and appreciate sort of the struggles that come with that. I think Senator Warner, and one of the reasons I was really excited about the work that Senator Warner's focused on, sort of in the pension and benefit side, is that he really sees this complementing all of the specific work he's doing with black lung. And so some of the things that he's worked to sort of advance and actually has gotten through on legislation is in 2017, he worked with Senator Manchin to pass legislation that secured health care for I think about 80,000 minors that were out of health care benefits due to bankruptcies. And now he's really turned his work to a bill called the American Minors Act, and that bill would help folks like Westmoreland minors and others that are affected by bankruptcies to get their health care benefits going forward. It would also secure the pensions for tens of thousands of minors that are impacted because of pension insolvency. And so that's something that he's been pushing for. I know he's been to the Senate floor at least twice in the last 3 to 4 months calling for a vote on the American Minors Act. And I expect he'll be back on the floor early in the fall, given the timeline and how serious this problem is. And it's something that Congress needs to address sooner rather than later. And so that's where he's put a lot of his effort on the American Minors Act and trying to get that advanced. He's also, as he referenced in the video, really concerned about what's going on with Black Jewel. When that process, bankruptcy process started, he did everything he could to try to lean on some of the financial institutions, banks, credit unions to make sure that they were aware of what was going on and could work with minors as they went through this process. He reached out to the 401k provider and worked and leaned on them to try to make sure that those benefits, if they needed access for a hardship withdrawal, could be made available. And he's taking a very serious look, as he mentioned, at the bankruptcy side of this. And I think, along with Senator Manchin, who has been another champion for minors' issues, he's looking into introducing legislation that will up the priority of pension and health care benefits during the bankruptcy process, because you shouldn't have that shielded after, as a worker, paying into that your entire career. So those are his really top priorities. But as Greg said, we're really excited to sit at the panels and hear more from some of the experts that are in the room today, but also hear from you and what is the top of your mind and what more we can do in DC to help assist you guys and improve both benefits and help with the health care regarding black lung. So with that, I will, I guess, open it up to questions, and we can go from there. Okay. Oh, you need this?
Nope, not yet. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So any questions for Greg and Craig related to the health policy, the process, the financial obligations of coal companies? Yep, back in the back here.
My question comes out of the Roanoke Times. They reported a little while back that the fund that funds black lung might go bankrupt. I know they used to charge $1 a ton for black lung fund, and I think maybe they might have increased it. But with the current production of coal in this country and the mines going away at a rapid rate, how are they going to sustain the benefits for black lung?
That's a really great question. You're right. What's called the black lung excise tax, which was $1.10, I think, per ton, dropped down. So it was basically cut in half. And we need to get that tax extended, first and foremost. And the senator, as part of the American Miners Act, would extend the black lung excise tax. He's also called for, and this is sort of a little in the weeds, but there are a whole bunch of tax provisions called tax extenders that expire every so often. Black lung excise tax happens to be one of those. And the senator has gone to leadership, both in the House and the Senate, and told them this black lung excise tax should be included in any extenders package that gets passed. And this fall, they'll probably be considering a package of some of these provisions. They're everything from healthcare to energy to depreciation. So there's a big mix of things that are involved with that. But his main priority in that package is the black lung excise tax. To your point about some of the challenges more broadly in the industry, I think there are different things, levers you can pull. One of the things that currently isn't taxed is coal that is exported. And so that is one thing to look at if you are looking to like broaden the base of the amount of coal that gets taxed, would be exported coal. I don't know if the senator ultimately will support that or not, but that is certainly something that he would look at, as well as just making sure that the economy is working well, so we are continuing to have production. But he's very, very committed to making sure that tax is implemented in a fair and a broadly applicable way.
Any other questions? Okay.
I'm Bethel Brock. I have complicated black lung PMF, and Westmoreland Coal just announced bankruptcy and filed, and the judges seem to be standing with open arms to all the coal companies that want to come in and be dismissed through bankruptcy. And this is going to kill the trust fund, because the trust fund, the benefits fund, is going to belly up too in reality if these coal companies, and they will all file bankruptcy because that's the easy way out for them. We know that. That's going to happen. Then we're sitting without, and they're paying less than they did in the 1980s into the fund for the tax on coal for black lung, and we know that we're going to be up the creek if, it's going to really hurt miners that are and so we just want to fight this battle as strongly as we can.
So maybe you could say something about, in terms of accountability for the coal companies as they go through this bankruptcy process. Maybe you could address that.
I think as the senator said in the video, what needs to be fundamentally changed, because the reason the coal companies use bankruptcy is because they can shed all of these liabilities and not pick up the tab, basically. And the way that bankruptcy works in terms of the waterfall of claims is that workers' claims, healthcare benefits, pension benefits, things like that, retirement benefits, are put at the bottom of the stack, and pretty much they know you're going to get, if anything, pennies on the dollar when they get out of bankruptcy as part of that process. And so I think that is what he is focused on in terms of bumping that up in priority. And so if for example, lawyers' fees and other things of that nature shouldn't be paid ahead of workers' benefits. And so I think if we can fix that, then it will make it much less appealing for companies to hide behind bankruptcy in order to shed those liabilities and keep going forward. Obviously, bankruptcy, it sometimes is appropriate for different companies, but it shouldn't be used inappropriately to try to drop benefits that are owed. I think that's how the senator views it.
Other questions about health? I need my running shoes.
I don't really have a question, but I just want to make a comment. I'm Josh West with the United Mine Workers, and want to thank the senator for all the work that he's done, you know, to help us as far as our pensions and health care. And, you know, if one thing I could say, if the miners in Southwest Virginia want something better, they need to stand up and organize and stand with us so that we can all get together and Senator Warner can keep helping us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you appreciate that. And I would just say thank you to all the miners who, we see you guys in the halls of Congress once a month. I mean, we'll see the T-shirts, you guys are up there, and, you know, that's not easy to do. We made the drive last night, right? It's a long drive up there. And so that effort and that advocacy for the things that you are entitled to really goes a long way, and it's meaningful for all the members who are walking in the halls to see you guys up there, to see the letters, to get the calls. And so just know that those efforts are really meaningful, and they do move the needle. And I remember the last time the senator was on the Senate floor calling for a vote on the American Miners Act and cajoling his colleagues to try to pass this soon because of, you know, there's a timeline here that inevitably we're going to have a crisis, and both with Westmoreland and the health care benefits and the pension benefits for miners. And when you looked up into the gallery, there were miners all around, listening to, you know, 6 or 7 senators down there on the floor trying to advocate for why this legislation needs to get passed. So that stuff's really meaningful, so thank you.
Okay.
I'm Wayne Herndon. I live here in Big Stone Gap. And I have a question about widows of deceased miners. How can they be helped? What benefits are they entitled to? I know several that have had their husbands, and in some cases maybe wives that work in the coal mines, they've had their lungs autopsied and biopsies taken, and I'm wondering how effective that's going to be for them to receive benefits if they don't already receive them, and what's the hope for those unfortunate ones that did not have biopsies of their deceased husband's lungs to show that they might have had black lung. Just what's the process they need to go through, and what's the possibility for them receiving these benefits?
Yeah, so, excuse me, I'd be happy. I'm getting over a cold, sorry about that. But I'd be happy to follow up with you after this. That is something that we have been working on, is streamlining, get the benefits that they deserve. Again, that's part of what we worked on in the Affordable Care Act, is streamlining that process. But even now, we're continuing to hear stories about, you know, individuals and widows that should qualify and are being put through the ringer. And so we have, you know, folks here who can help you enroll and help you navigate that process. But also, I'd be happy to follow up with you after this, so that you know, I can get a bit more details about, you know, the scenarios you're talking about, and figure out there's some things we can do on the legislative end as well, and connect you with some of our federal partners.
Any other questions? Anybody want to send a message back to Senator Warner with these folks? Anything that you feel is necessary for him to hear directly from you? Yep.
I was diagnosed with black lung in 2010. The company I work for, I won't mention, but I worked for them for 21 years. I was drawing a pension from them for my 20 years. Also, I had a 20-year ring. And when I applied for black lung, this is the only company I ever worked for. When I applied for black lung, they didn't know me. They did not know me. They said I never worked for them. I had to prove through the Social Security Administration that I'd actually worked for that company to get black lung benefits. Another thing too that's really, really hard is that once you apply for black lung and you get a preliminary approval through Black Lung. Now, it may have changed since then, but it was stated in there that if I was not approved through there for Black Lung by the courts or whatever they had to go through, then I had to pay that back. Now that's a pretty harsh thing, and then what that does is that either tells the minor that's got the Black Lung, well, I just need to give this up because, you know, if I can't prove it absolutely, I don't have a job and I can't work and I have to pay these benefits back. So he needs to understand that some of these minors here won't apply or don't apply because of the things that I said. And it's extremely hard for a minor that has worked 3 years here for this company or 5 years there for that company and 10 years for another company. Who is it that's going to pay for the Black Lung? You know what I'm saying? It's hard to prove that.
No, I definitely appreciate that comment, and as I've said, that's part of what we've worked on in the past, and we know there's more to do. I think that goes, back to my point about the health screenings, where even going to get your health screening to see, if you're working for a company and you are afraid to go get your screening because of retaliation, that shouldn't be the case, and that is what we're going to be working on in the next few months to years, making sure that there isn't that intimidation factor, both in making sure that you're taking care of yourself by getting the health screenings that you need, but also making sure that minors aren't afraid to actually apply and get the benefits they deserve or aren't being unfairly treated and denied when they do apply for claims. So that's something I can look into and see if that's still occurring. I know in the Affordable Care Act we did do a lot to ensure that minors weren't unfairly, that their claims weren't unfairly denied and remove some of those elements from the process. But there's more work to do. There's always more work to do. There's always stories that we get that come into our office and we have to look into and figure out exactly what's going on, and hearing that from you definitely helps that process.
My name is Thelma Gilly. I worked for the Black Lung office from the date Black Lung bill was passed, December 31st, 1969. In 1974, I changed from Social Security and went to the Department of Labor and worked till 94 when I retired. I have been on the whole side of the minor with the Black Lung program since its inception. My advice to the people who are approved for Black Lung and the coal company is paying you, if you have a need for that money, you spend it. They cannot draw blood from a turnip once it's gone.
I'd sort of like to. Cousin is deceased, and he had to do the same thing he was talking about. He got his benefits, had to pay them back. He got a mortgage for his house. He ended up, he couldn't afford to pay the payments, and so he lost his home through having to pay back the Black Lung benefits.
Let me get over here.
Hi, Wes Addington, Appalachian Citizens Law Center. I think I want to follow up on a couple of these comments. What folks are expressing here is if they're approved at the district director level, benefits will commence because the responsible operator, the coal company or the insurance company that's responsible for paying will never pay until the case is final and the minor's been awarded or the widow's been awarded. And so what happens is the Department of Labor steps in and pays interim benefits. And what people are explaining here is the process can take a very long time, it can take many years. So minors or widows can be drawing benefits for a long time and then ultimately lose the case. Maybe the evidence wasn't there, maybe the initial diagnosis was incorrect, whatever the case may be, or maybe they had a difficult judge and weren't able to prove right now. The problem is then the Department of Labor wants all of their money back, okay? There is a waiver process for that if the minor can show a hardship or the widow can show a hardship. Our office can often help with that, but I can tell you that paperwork is confusing and difficult. It doesn't always arrive when you expect, and so what we often find is minors and widows feel like they're obligated to return all that money in situations where they might not be, or in other cases where technically they have enough money to return it, but like the gentleman explained, it created a huge financial hardship for them to do so. So I guess a message that you could take back to Senator Warner is, you know, this is the Department of Labor that's creating the responsibility to return the funds. It seems like there could be a more fair, they're the ones that adjudicate, that earlier determined that the minor should receive the funds in the first place. So it's not these minors and widows' fault that they were receiving money from the government. And then once the government determines they're not eligible, I don't think the government should then expect them to return all of that. It should be, although there's a way of waiving that, it should be a little more fair than it currently is. I mean, it really should be forgiven.
Can I just ask a question? I'm just curious.
Sure.
Because it seems like if you, it's not a benefit at all if you don't actually get, if there's a chilling effect in terms of the process, right? And so is the reason the process takes so long on the company's side or on the Department of Labor side, or is it both? Like, why is that process so long when you're out there with that uncertainty? You're getting those benefits, but on the back end, obviously, you have that threat of perhaps losing them if you lose.
Yeah, historically, it's been both.
Okay.
It's been a combination of insurance companies and coal companies that realize it's to their benefit to litigate as long as possible, because they're really not on the hook for anything other than attorney fees, their own attorney fees, until the case is over. And if the case drags on for 15 years, or like in the case of Westmoreland, a lot of those cases are now being returned to government responsibility. They've not been out anything by prolonging that litigation other than paying their own attorney to do so. They've saved lots of money doing it. You also have a system that over the years has been overwhelmed with cases. I mean, we have a lot of sick minors and widows, and so the process has taken way longer than it should have. There was one point in time where some of my clients were waiting 4 years for a hearing, just to get a hearing. Often the post-hearing time to get a decision can take a year or two. And then you have multiple appeals. You know, there's an incentive to just keep these going as long as possible. And so it's stressful for minors and widows that have heard stories of people having to pay back money, and they're worried as they're receiving these benefits that they so desperately need that this all may come crashing down at some point and lead to financial ruin. And it would be nice if that, I mean, they're already dealing with, you know, often fatal lung disease and a very slow, painful process, and the added stress, the financial stress of worrying about whether that benefit's going to be there, it really should be relieved.
Yes, I'm Mike Kaiser from Southwest Virginia Black Lung Association. Up where we're from, something needs to be addressed. Like a minor dies and he's drawing his black lung, and the spouses start drawing his widow's fund. Then they take it away from them. We need to address that in the Senator too.
I'm Dean Vance. I'm from the Southwest Virginia Black Lung Association also. And I'd like, you know, we can stand here, every one of us has probably seen these disabled coal miners on the auction. They can't walk. But I'd like to invite Senator Warner, Tim Kaine, anybody here to attend one of these black lung meetings. You know, it's a whole lot to stand up here and talk about it, but when you actually see these people, it gets to your heart. And you know, I'd like to invite the TV crews, anybody, We have our meeting the third Tuesday of every month at Van Sant Anchorage Shopping Center. And you ought to see some of these men that come in on auction, they can't walk, and they can't get a dime. And without people like Mark Warner and Tim Kaine fighting for us, and if we don't stand behind them, we can't get nothing. We got to get united. We got to show these congressmen, we got to show these senators, we mean business, and if we stick together, we can get something done.
All right, we are out of time for this panel, so we are going to take a break. I'm sure that Greg and Craig will be around to talk with folks individually.
Yeah, please come up, and if you want to talk a little bit more about any of these issues or things that weren't discussed, we'll be here for the afternoon, so please come talk to us.
So we'll take a 10-minute break and then come back. All right, we're going to get started here in just a minute. If everybody will take their seats. So as folks are coming in from out in the lobby, I do want to remind you to please go visit the tables out in the lobby. These are ARC Power grantees. They include the Appalachian Citizens Law Center, the Southwest Virginia Alliance for Manufacturing, Stone Mountain Health Services, and Virginia Career Works. And there's also a table out there for Mountain Empire Community College. So be sure to go by and talk to those folks and get some information. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and this is our first panel of the day, and I'm just going to give just a brief introduction to for our panelists. John Robinson is going to speak first. He is a retired coal miner. Brad Johnson is with Stone Mountain Health Services, and he can share what his multiple roles are there. And then Wes Addington, who we've already heard from today in the audience, is you're the executive director. That's right. Of the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. So we're going to be talking about the black lung claims process, and as I said, John is going to start us off.
My name's John Robinson, 53 years old. I was diagnosed with black lung at the age of 47. Seemed like my black lung was sort of idle, I guess, at that one stage, like a 1 point something for a long time. I've been out of mines. October makes 6 years, I think, that I got pulled out of the mines. So like I said, I stayed around a 1 point something for a long time. And then this last reading I had was a 2.53, something like that. I can't even remember second stage. So it had advanced. I was just going to tell you a little bit about my family stuff and how it's affected me and my family. Been married 34 years. I got 2 daughters. I have 2 granddaughters, and one thing hit me the other night. We're in the process. We sold our house in Coven, moved to Nicholsville, and building a house, and it's not done yet. And the grandbaby, they have this little old hairball dog. I don't even know what to call that thing, but she thinks the world of it, and she's wanting to chase it. She's wanting me to chase it with her, hold her hand. She's going on 2. I tried, but that didn't work too good. She had a little bit more steam than I did, more air. But you know, it hurt me in a way that I couldn't play with her the way I wanted to play with her and run with her and all. And kind of messed me up when I got to thinking about it. You know, her only 2. What's it going to be like? You know, years down the road as she gets older, wants to do stuff outside, and I won't even be able to play and stuff with her. And but anyway, you know, that's life, I guess. I enjoyed coal mining. I love coal mining. I just never did dread going to work. Had a good time. Had good friends. Just enjoyed it. And then when I got the news that I was being pulled out of the mines, and it started out as some other health issues, then once I had my surgeries and all, I found out I had breathing issues, and they told me I needed to be checked. I found I had a black lung, and it seemed like everything sort of went downhill for me there at 47-year-old. And but anyway, you know, we've learned to deal with it. It's hard. It's can't do the things I used to do. Everything I do, I struggle. I'm out of wind real easy. It's just hard. I know I'm not the same husband I used to be to my wife. Same dad I used to be to my kids, or the same grandpa I used to be to my granddaughters, you know. But that's just life. I guess we learn to deal with it and learn to adjust, try to. But I still struggle after 6 years. I still struggle. Like I said, I enjoyed coal mining. But anyway, we go on, and I am receiving my black lung. I went, I think, almost a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, before a judge to see if I get to keep my black lung, which is, I've heard nothing on that yet. And but I feel 100%. If they go by the paperwork and the pictures and all that, there's no reason why a fellow should be denied. That's what I feel anyway, and my hopes in God that I will get to keep it. And But
John, if you were to give one piece of advice to minors right now, what would it be?
well, take care of yourself, or protect your lungs, and it's hard. I tried wearing a mask, and I had wore it some to prevent it, but those masks are not 100% either. They're having trouble out of those. But try to wear it if you can, but it's when you're hustling, getting it, and trying to make things happen and get stuff done, it's hard to wear a mask over your face, smothering you to death. It's more restricting the air than it is helping you. And automatically, when your air is restricted, first thing you want to do, whatever's on your face, you want to pull it off your face. If somebody were putting their hand over your face, you would do your best to get their hand off your face. And I tell people, they say, what's it like to have black lung? How do you feel? I said, well, get your push mower out, go get your pillow off the bed, put your pillow over your face, and go push mow your yard. And you'll know what black lung feels like. It's just a smothering, choking thing. And the more you do, the more active you are, the harder it is on you. You can sit around, do pretty good breathing, but who wants to sit around all the time? You got to live. I mean, you got to be a person. You got to do stuff.
Thank you.
I just say try to do your best to take care of your lungs the best you can. Do what you can.
Brad, do you want to pick up from there? It seems like a good segue.
Okay. Yes, good morning, everybody. See a lot of familiar faces out there and some new faces, so good morning. I hope we can have a lot more of these summits in the future. This is a great thing. We need to keep awareness on these issues and hope to continue it. What we were going to talk to, work with Stone Mountain Health Services at the Van Sant, Virginia office. I'm site manager and lay representative. So what does that mean? Of course, in the office, we file the claims, work it up through the Department of Labor, and then we also represent the minors at the hearings. So I go in front of the judges as well from a lay rep's point of view. But here today, we were going to kind of break it down just a little bit. I was going to talk about the initial steps, and then Wes was going to follow in with when you get in front of the judge. So let's kind of talk about how the case starts out. How many guys in here have filed a claim before or have an active claim? So you got a good idea of what goes on. You file that claim initially with the Department of Labor, and you do your application, and be very detailed in that application. You know, really list the work history, the medical conditions, all that information. That'll come into play later on. And you're submitting all your birth certificate and all the normal paperwork. Department of Labor receives that application, and then they start processing it. So what is the first things that they do? They got to put all potential responsible operators on notice. So they'll file them all a notice of a claim. They legally got to give them the opportunity to say whether or not you work for them, whether you got black lung, all that stuff. So they legally got to do that. So in that time frame, then you're going for your Department of Labor exam, and Department of Labor is working all this up. And then a few months down the line from that, the Department of Labor will, after they've investigated the responsible operator issue, then they will issue what they call a schedule of submission of additional evidence. So what that is based off who they've determined is responsible, and that Department of Labor exam, whether or not you're entitled to benefits. Would be or would not be entitled to. Everybody kind of familiar with that part of it. So what does that do? So you have not submitted anything up to that point, but once you get that opens it up for whoever's been determined responsible and the minor to start submitting evidence. So hopefully somewhere along this line you have started submitting or developing your evidence. What evidence can you submit with your case? Chest x-ray, pulmonary function study, arterial blood gas. If you got something that can link disability from your heart related to your lungs, well-reasoned medical opinions. So hopefully you've started developing this evidence. You can start submitting, the company can start submitting. You're allowed, both sides at this point, you're allowed to submit up to 2 of everything, 2 breathing and 2 x-rays. You don't have to submit 2 at this level, but you can. So whatever you submit, and the Department of Labor has given both sides so long to do this, but whatever you submit up to this point, then the next step out, the Department of Labor is going to issue that proposed decision in order, saying based off of all this evidence up to this point, whether or not you should be drawing benefits. So that's where Wes will talk about that in a little bit after that point. But I just kind of wanted to tell a little bit about that process. And one of the big things that, and John could attest to this in his case, getting that paper trail going early, developing that evidence. I mean, you may have an x-ray this year, 2 years from now that may have progressed in the complicated black lung. Or you may have a breathing test this year, and 2 years from now it's below the disability standards. The same thing for the blood gases, all of that. So developing that medical evidence is so important in these cases. And so for the evidence, but then also one of the big things that a minor always struggles with is a well-reasoned medical opinion from a doctor. How do you get a well-reasoned medical opinion? You cannot get that well-reasoned opinion if you have not developed that evidence over time so that doctor can base that opinion on that evidence. So it is critical to do that. So that's kind of a quick overview of the initial process. So how would you? And then that would lead up to the West, going for the hearings.
Thanks, Brad. Again, my name is Wes Addington, Appalachian Citizens Law Center. We're in Whitesburg, Kentucky. We work on federal black lung claims along with other work, basically in response to the coal industry. So we represent miners on safety discrimination claims. We represent families and organizations in environmental claims, among other things. But I've spent quite a bit of time at ACLC working in the federal black lung benefits system. And what I can pick up on from what Brad was saying is once you receive a proposed decision in order from the Department of Labor, then what happens? So in this system, a minor is trying to prove that they're totally disabled due to pneumoconiosis. So basically, you're totally disabled due to black lung. Proving that you have black lung isn't enough in the federal system, okay? Many minors that we see in our office can prove they have black lung, but they might not be quite impaired enough to qualify for benefits. But that doesn't mean that they won't be impaired enough over time to then qualify for benefits. So, as a lot of you know, black lung is both a latent, can be both a latent and progressive disease. So it might not appear immediately, or like while you're working, it might not appear after you stop working for a while. When it does appear, it doesn't mean that it's not going to get any worse. Frequently, it does progress and get worse. So in the federal system, a minor can file multiple claims over time, whereas a widow, and this is why it's kind of crucial, there was a question about widows' benefits earlier, a widow typically only gets one shot at filing. The way the law looks at it is the minor's pulmonary status when he passes away is what it is. You get one chance to prove that it caused his death, and if you're not successful, even if you didn't have any representation, you didn't have a lay representative, you didn't have an attorney helping you, you didn't know what to submit, even if you had enough evidence to prove that his death was caused by black lung, you only get that one shot. So it's critically important that when a survivor files for benefits, that they put the best case forward that they can.
Is there a statute of limitations?
For minors, there is a statute of limitations. When a minor is given a reasoned opinion from a doctor that he's totally disabled due to black lung, he has 3 years to file. So if a minor receives that sort of opinion, either orally or written, they need to go ahead and get a claim filed. For survivors, there's not one. I have had survivors in our office come in 20 years after the minor passes away, and for whatever reason had heard that it's too difficult or whatever the reason may be and hadn't filed. They could still file at that point. But if they had filed 20 years ago and lost, in most cases, they're forever barred from proving their claim. So that's just kind of an introduction to what you have to prove in the process. And once you receive that proposed decision and order, then the litigation often occurs before the administrative law judge. And when I say often, in every situation, either the coal company or the responsible operator is going to ask for a hearing before a judge if they're not happy with the Department of Labor's initial decision. In 15 years, I can't ever remember a company saying, "You're right, this miner is incredibly sick, is terminal, and we're going to pay benefits." It never happens. So they always ask for a hearing. And what happens at that point is the Department of Labor transfers the file to the Office of Administrative Law Judges within the Department of Labor. They take everything in your file at that point. They call them director's exhibits. So it's basically a copy of the file that they've paginated and created, multiple exhibits out of, and they forward that along, okay? Once that gets to the national office, which is in DC, there's a number of different judges' offices around the country, and many of the minors that have had hearings probably know that your judge didn't come from a place that's close by where we are. The regional offices that we typically see for minors in this area, if you're a Virginia minor, you often will get judges either from Newport News or Washington, D.C. If you're a Kentucky minor, you'll often get judges from Cincinnati. If you're West Virginia minors, you may get judges from Pittsburgh. However, the system is so overwhelmed with cases, or has been over the years, that they've had to farm these cases out all over the country so that judges can try to have timely hearings. So our clients have seen and still are seeing judges from San Francisco, judges from Louisiana, judges from the Boston office, places where there are no coal mines and haven't been. And so just to handle the load of cases, you may have a judge that flies across the country to hear your case. And so what happens is once you get assigned to one of those offices, you'll get assigned to a judge. Eventually, that judge will issue what's called a notice of hearing, okay? That will tell you when your hearing is going to be and where the location is and who your judge is, okay? And typically, you'll have, in these cases, from the time that they ask for a hearing, you may receive a notice of hearing in 6 months. You may not receive a notice of hearing for a year. It may even be longer than that. Once you receive the notice of hearing, often they schedule those hearings anywhere from about 3 to 6 months after the notice. So they do give you a little time to prepare for the upcoming hearing. They let you know it's happening. Not much is happening until that point. You may not receive a document until you get that notice of hearing. But once you receive that, then you know there's going to be a hearing and the case is kind of ramping up for that. Once you go to the hearing, what happens there, I try to make our clients as comfortable as they can be about the hearing process. It's not like something you see on TV where you go into a packed courtroom and you're going to be on display for everyone to perform. That's not at all what the experience for most minors is. Often, the judge is present, you and your lawyer or representative is present, the coal company or insurance company's lawyer is there, and often the only other person in the room is a court reporter that's just recording the hearing. And so those hearings typically last anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. That's about what they schedule them for, is about 45 minutes to an hour apart. They can last longer than that. They can be shorter than that. It all depends on your case. At the hearing, the judge will take in both the claimants. They'll enter these director's exhibits from the government. And sometimes a Department of Labor attorney will be present if the company is claiming that they're not the right party. If they're saying another company is responsible, the Department of Labor may show up to say, no, we named the correct company, Judge, you should stick with that company. The judge will enter the Department of Labor's exhibits. They'll take any exhibits that you develop into evidence, any exhibits that the employer develops into evidence. At the start of the hearing, there may be arguments over which evidence is actually allowed to come in. There may be requests from the employer, maybe requests from the claimant to say, Judge, keep the record open for a period of time to allow us to respond to evidence or to enter other evidence. After all of that's settled, generally the minor or the widow will testify. And often we'll have them testify about their work experience, level of dust that they were exposed to, what their experience was, or in a widow's case, what they observed, you know, how the minor looked when they came home from work, what their clothes were like, who, you know, took care of the laundry, that sort of thing, just to give the judge a sense of the kind of exposure that this minor has been exposed to over his career. The minor also then testify similarly to what John's talked about here is just, you know, what it's like living with this condition, you know, and how difficult it is. And everyone, often our clients have unique ways of describing that to me can be very powerful because they ring so true. I've never heard anyone explain living with black lung the way he just did, but we all can sort of imagine what that might feel like if you put a pillow over your face and tried to do something strenuous, how difficult that would be. And so that's why I think it's important to get that testimony on the record, to let the judge know that you're not just a case file, but you're a human and this has been your experience. So after that happens, unlike TV, there's not a big closing argument where attorneys get up and try to win the case, okay? Typically, there really is no argument at the end of the hearing. What the judge will allow is time after the hearing to produce, after you get the written transcript of the hearing, time to produce a closing argument from both sides. And often those can be, you know, quite lengthy and very detailed. It's a very complex system, and it requires discussion of complex medical issues. Often employers, attorneys, even in cases in which the minor is clearly entitled, will try to muddy the water as best they can to make the case more complex than it is. And so you have to deal with all those in a closing argument. And, you know, and so that gets us a few months out from the hearing. At that point, once those are filed, then the judge has the case. And then it's up to the judge to render a decision. Depending on how many cases the judge has at that point, depending on sort of their workflow, depending on how fast or slow they are, will determine when you get a decision. I think you said that you've been waiting a year or so. So that's not atypical. I mean, that's more common than not. Sometimes I have had judges get those decisions back in a few months, but that's pretty unusual. I have had judges take as long as 2 or 3 years to get that decision back. You know, part of the issue in issuing a decision is they are complex. They're long. They're not just a summary of, oh, I took in this evidence, I took in that evidence, I just think you should win. End of story, it's 3 pages and we move on. That's not at all what's produced by these judges. In this particular case, I just grabbed one at random from the office. The judge's decision was 36 pages, you know, and so it does take a while to produce something like that, but the system obviously takes too long. Once you receive that decision, unfortunately, that's also not necessarily the end of the line. If your case is strong enough, occasionally companies at that point will concede and pay the case. Often they will appeal again to what's called the Benefits Review Board. That's still within the Department of Labor. These are all different offices within the Department of Labor. That process of appeal can take about another year. And at that point, that board, if the judge, if there were problems with the decision, whether in favor of the claimant or against the claimant, can be sent back to the judge to reconsider. It can bounce like that a couple different times. And so all of our clients' experiences can be different. So these claims, you know, a really strong claim could wrap up in a couple years, or a really strong claim could take a decade. A case that's not as strong also may wrap up in a few years. It really depends on how the litigation progresses over time. I took a case on that our office had for about a year when I first started at ACLC in '04, and that case wrapped up last fall. So it was 15 years. My boss, that was the prior director at ACLC, had a widow's claim that lasted. The widow's husband died in the Scotia mine disaster in 1976. Her black lung claim was not resolved until 2005, so 29 years. Now, those are the exceptions. Those are extreme. But it is not unusual for a minor's case to take 7, 8, 9 years, a decade, even longer.
So what happens in the unfortunate situation, I know this happens, during this process, given how long it takes, if a minor dies during that process?
Yeah, so that doesn't end the case. The case can and should continue on behalf of the minor's estate. You know, in most situations, if the minor's wife, or if the minor's a female, the minor's husband is still living, often they'll step into their shoes. They may even have a case of their own as a survivor. Sometimes those cases can be combined, and where you're litigating them both. Actually, the one I picked up, exactly the scenario that you mentioned had happened, and so when we went to hearing, we were both having a hearing on her claim and her husband's claim at the same time. And like I've stated before, two different things you have to prove. Now, one of the benefits of the Affordable Care Act and the Byrd amendments that we talked about earlier this morning is you now have an automatic entitlement provision. So if the minor wins his case and it's over with and it's final, the widow no longer has to prove anything. She doesn't have to go back and prove all the same sorts of things that the minor was being forced to prove, and in some cases even having a higher burden than the minor had to win her case. So at least in that situation, if we can win the minor's claim, her claim is awarded.
And also with the Byrd Amendment, is it 15 years? If a minor has worked for 15 years, what does that do for him or
yeah,
her?
and so what that is, and when we say the Byrd Amendments, these are not new ideas. These were in the law in the 1980s and were taken out of the process. I guess at a point in time, our government thought that too many minors were qualifying for benefits that they deserved, and so they made it more difficult. So the eligibility criteria can change, you know, so it doesn't mean that this is always written in stone and people should fight to keep what they have. But the 15-year presumption, what that does is a minor that's worked at least 15 years of mining underground or in a similarly situated mine, which means surface mines, or they can work at a prep plant, they can work in coal mining and be exposed to dust on a regular basis.
Even truck drivers?
Yeah, if you're exposed to dust on a regular basis, you can be considered a minor. You don't even have to necessarily be a minor working for the company. I've had guys that were sampling dust at a mine, but were there, you know, long enough for so much of their career that they developed lung disease from being underground and being exposed. So you don't even have to work for a coal company to be a minor in this system. So the 15-year presumption is you work at least 15 years and you have a disabling lung disease. So you have exposure and you have disability. The law assumes what's at least causing part of that disability is all that exposure. It's a pretty fair presumption. And then once that presumption kicks in, the employer has to prove that your disability is in no way affected by your dust exposure. And guess what? And often in these cases, when you have that disability and that exposure, it is caused by it. So they're having a much more difficult time proving that it's not under this system than they were when they could just say, oh, it's anything but coal dust. It's smoking, it's your weight, it's your heart, it's any other weird condition that I can think of to say that might be causing this rather than your coal dust. So they can't defend these claims like they used to, which is just throw everything they can against a wall and see what works out, see what sticks. So yeah, both the 15-year presumption and the automatic entitlement now are part of law.
So I want to ask John about, because you mentioned, and Brad, you did too, how important it is for that paper trail, the evidence, and creating it from the start, even though you might get, as I think, Brad, you mentioned, you might get an x-ray in this year, it's not showing that much damage to the lungs, but because black lung is progressive in 2 years, it's going to show more. What was the evidence, John, that you started compiling to help with your case?
Before I even know that I even had black lung, I'd had a couple of surgeries. So I had 2 things done at one time. I took off work on my own. I didn't turn nothing in against the company. Had these surgeries. Come out of surgery, I don't remember nothing because I was knocked out or whatever. They said I followed them. They had me on 100% oxygen or whatever. I think they could go. I think they said they had me like at 80% or something with 100%. And they said I followed them hard, you know. And they asked my wife, said, "Is he always like that? You know, is he mean like it?" She said, "Well, I know." But anyway, I guess struggling fire, you're going to fight. But anyway, that's what kind of got me started. I hope I'm answering your question right. But that's what got me started on. They recommended I go to a breathing doctor, tried to, something was going on. And my wife, she's the type, she's a pushy type. You know, she don't give up. So she kept after me, you know, and it just kept going, and then she said, we're going to start a paper trail. And we're going to keep up with every medicine we buy, every trip we make, whatever doctor we see. And believe me, we've definitely got some papers. We definitely got a trail. But, you know, and I don't mean to get off your question, but, you know, he'd said something about something, or anyway, what kicked in was, I've been told, when all this first started for me, I've been told my problem was, well, you're overweight. The guy told me that I was overweight was bigger than I was. And then I've been told I need to start exercising. You know, I've been told so much junk from doctors, and bottom line, nobody wanted to admit to what I had. I guess they you said black lung, you cussed right in the face, and they didn't like that. I was told one time I had miner's asthma. I never heard of miner's asthma. Wife goes home, looks it up on the computer, and it says pneumococcus or whatever. I mean, the doctors just won't. I started going to St. Charles and started getting some answers. That's what I'm gonna tell you. I started getting the truth. And then, but like I said, the first paper trail, I mean, if I'm answering your question, I hope I am.
You did, yes. And I think one thing too I want to ask about is because the coal company or the insurance company can also require the miner to go to their doctors, correct? Now, did you do that? Did you go to one of their or 2 of their doctors?
Yes, I did. I want to tell you a story on that too. They sent me up to up past Claypool Hill back in there, left-handed. I can't remember the name of the place. Well, I go to the hospital. I thought I went to the hospital to have all this done. I get to the hospital. They said, no, you got to go across the road. Well, I go across the road, and thank God we had a 4-wheel drive because the potholes is pitiful. Well, we get to the building, and there's a logging chain on the locks, and there's graffiti all over the walls. And the weeds, I asked that people, I said, have y'all ever been snake bit? I said, there's copperheads everywhere out there because the weeds was up to your neck. This whole building been shut down for years, and they hired this doctor from somewhere to come in. They throwed him in the building. I get in the building. It's dark. I see one room lit up. Finally, I go to that room and talking to this guy and told him what I was there for, and then I asked him, I said, do they not like you or something? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, there's copperheads everywhere, there's graffiti everywhere, there's logging chains on the door. He said, they just hire me to come in and do this deal here process. Of course, he denied me, but he was paid to say that. Bottom line, the company paid him to say, hey, you know, you don't prove nobody or whatever. Pitiful setup, just pitiful, but that's the company.
Thank you, John. Brad and Wes, do you want to say something to that?
I want to say something back about that paper trail just a minute.
Sure.
Talking about that. And it's kind of goes along with what Wes said a minute ago about how the companies, they try to put it off on anything and everything other than black lung. You know, that paper trail, those x-rays, if you do an x-ray, you know, just to kind of give you an idea, a few years ago, you do an x-ray, and we're here today talking about complicated black lung, PMF. So you had an x-ray that showed complicated. First thing company's going to say, well, it's something else. It's cancer, it's tuberculosis, it's histoplasmosis, it's all these other things. You've done that x-ray, first thing your doctor is going to do is testing to rule out these other possibilities. You're building that paper trail. So you do that x-ray, do all this other testing, do another x-ray, those spots are still there. You're making your case, a strong case, showing what it is. And so go from that back to something else, and maybe Wes can follow up on this when I'm done. We talked about the 15-year presumption. You know, you're looking at the presumption by proving disability with the breathing test, the opinion letters, the blood gases, that type of stuff. You can prove disability just in that x-ray or the CT or the biopsy in itself. If it shows complicated coworkers pneumoconiosis, pulmonary massive fibrosis, what that is, that entitles you to the irrebuttable presumption. So there's several different ways that you go about these cases. You build your case, if you're going on complicated, one way. If you're building it on breathing test or blood gas, you're looking at it from a different perspective. So maybe Wes could follow up on that irrebuttable presumption.
Yeah, you know, dust in the lung is an irritant. It can cause conditions that are sort of unique in only minors, but it also can cause conditions that other irritants to the lungs, whether smoking or other exposures, can also cause. So at least in the federal system, you can prove disability in a couple different ways. And you know, we were talking about physicians and doctors' visits. When you file your case, you get to get a free exam from the Department of Labor. They have a list of approved providers. They have, you know, some of the doctors on the list are used primarily by insurance companies and coal companies. So I'm not sure minors get a fair evaluation if they choose those particular doctors. But let's say you get a doctor that gives you a full exam and a good reason report. What that doctor will do is he'll give you an x-ray. He'll do a pulmonary function test where you're blowing into a hose and they're measuring, you know, your breathing. He'll do, or she will do an arterial blood gas test, both at rest and hopefully, if you're able, while you're exercising. And any of those three tests can help you prove your claim. In some minors, their lung condition is causing their ability to move air in and out of their lungs to the point that they're impaired, so the pulmonary function test could prove that they're disabled. In other minors, it only appears when you measure the oxygen in their blood. And so they're maybe able to move air okay, but if they're resting, or especially if they're, you know, walking stairs or just doing anything moderately exertional, then the oxygen drops in their blood and you can prove disability. What Brad was talking about, even if you don't have disability, you may have some impairment, you may have no impairment, but even if you can't prove it through pulmonary function tests or blood gases, if your x-ray or CT scan, or if you had a biopsy, if those show large masses of black lung, you know, what we're here today for, progressive massive fibrosis, complicated pneumoconiosis, essentially areas of disease that are larger than about a centimeter, then you can qualify for benefits even if you can't prove that your test scores are low enough on these other tests. So that there's a couple different ways of proving a claim and showing that you have progressive massive fibrosis, and we're seeing so many of those cases now. When I first started at ACLC, I only had 1 or 2 instances where a minor even showed the earliest stage of progressive massive fibrosis on an x-ray. And in one of those, it didn't even pan out. None of the other doctors read it that way. Now we're getting those cases in almost weekly, and often we're getting guys with much more advanced disease than that. So anymore, even the company's radiologists and readers are proving our cases because the masses are so large and so typical, like, you know, so representative of what you would see in complicated pneumoconiosis that they don't have anything else to blame it on. And so you're able to prove your case.
However, and I'm going to go out for questions right now, there was an expose where a law firm was withholding evidence because they did not like the their readers' interpretation of the minor's test. So any questions for the panelist?
Two questions, actually. Is there both a state black lung disability claims process and a federal? And secondly, once a minor has won their case, an award has been made, is that permanent? Or is there a likelihood come up for review or whatnot?
I'll answer the second question. I'll let Wes answer the first one. The second one, once you get an award from the judge or from the Department of Labor, whenever that company accepts liability, so you can enter intern pay status and draw benefits from the Department of Labor. That's not final. You know, that's when you could lose them at some point. But whenever the company accepts liability for that claim and you start drawing it from that insurance company, you'll get an insurance card and the monthly benefits would come from them. That's final. They can't take it at that point. That's the end of it. So
yeah, and I'll follow up on that a little bit. So it is a final award. Once it's final, it is a final award with an exception. There is a modification procedure in the law. Unfortunately, minors and their widows have a year from denial to begin that modification procedure. If they don't try to modify, basically reopen the case, if they don't try to do that within a year, it's over. That particular claim is final and you can't revive it. Unfortunately, the way the law is written on the operator's side, if it's 1 year since the time you last paid benefits. So even if you have a final claim that they're paying benefits on, in theory, they can reopen it or try to reopen it any time. Now that generally doesn't happen. The only instances where I've experienced that happening is where a minor had won a case, and this is before the Byrd amendments, which really helped too. When a widow had to prove her claim, sometimes companies, when the minor died, would try to reopen his if there had been, for example, autopsy evidence or other evidence that came in that would give their experts just something to grasp onto that would maybe try to change the theory of the case. And if they could do that, maybe, but that's rare. They have a huge hurdle to try to reopen any of these cases. They can't just file for modification and try to prove it just like we're starting all over again. That's not the way that works. They have a bunch of legal burdens that they have to, overcome to do that. So in theory, they can, but generally, once a case is final and a company's began paying benefits, that's the end of the case. Your first question about state workers' comp systems is different in every state. Our office doesn't handle them because typically there's enough workers' comp attorneys in the different states to work on state black lung claims. Now, what I will tell you is that there's a dollar for dollar offset. If a minor wins a state black lung claim and is receiving a benefit, and also wins his federal black lung claim and is receiving a benefit, those offset dollar for dollar. So although it may be to the advantage to win both, and there's situations where the state workers' comp may run out, may be just a period of years that you receive that benefit, whereas federal is for life, and it may make sense to file for both and win both. People should know that you can't receive both benefits fully at the same time.
So I'm going to, had a little bug in my ear. Will you talk about the importance of smoking and how that might impact claims?
Okay, and I think we got a question in the back after that. And I'll address the smoking real quick while you're making your way back there. It can, smoking is, we all know smoking can cause lung disease. It can cause totally disabling and fatal lung disease. However, just because somebody has a smoking history, that doesn't just completely negate their mining history. Often some of the sickest people that we see are people that have, long histories of both, because you have both irritants working together. A number of physicians will say there's a synergy there between the two exposures that, this exposure and this exposure, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it may equal 4. It may exacerbate your lung problems because you have both of those exposures. But that doesn't mean that your mining exposure isn't significant in your lung disease. And it doesn't knock you out of benefits just because you have a smoking history. But it is something that has to be litigated in these claims and explained by medical professionals.
I want to comment on that too, just real quick. Following up on that, and so this will fall into it. If you're entitled to that 15-year presumption, you may have a smoking history, but the question is, did they completely rule out black lung as a possibility in that disability?
And I would say for people that are filing black lung claims, you want to think about if you have been a smoker, especially if you've been an irregular smoker and you've tried to quit multiple times over the years, as many smokers do, try to think about what your actual history is as you're starting the claim. Because sometimes it's difficult for people to recount exactly like when they quit and how long they stayed quit, and when they resumed, exactly how many packs a day were they smoking more than they used to when they were younger or less or whatever. Think about that smoking history and conclude for yourself what it is. And that way, when you're being pressed in depositions or being asked by doctor's offices, that smoking history doesn't vary a lot. Because once they have a record of you saying 1 pack a day at this point in time and 2 packs a day at a different point in time, you want to be honest with that. You want to be completely honest with that, but you just don't want to make it look like, even if you're trying your best to remember, you don't want to make it look like you're changing that history, because they will try to use that against you.
I'd like to make a statement regarding collection of medical evidence. Years ago, we would send, the Department of Labor would send a person to a doctor who had previously seen the claimant, and the doctor would write back no evidence of pneumoconiosis. Well, I'm talking to this guy, and he says, well, he told me 15 years ago that I had black lung. I said, bring the report in. He brought it in, and I sent a statement in. I don't understand if I had black lung 15 years ago. And please get your evidence. Keep the documents. Don't ever throw away medical reports. Thank you.
All right, we've got just like a couple more minutes. Any other questions that you would like to ask the panelists? And here again, I'm sure they'll be around to talk to folks.
Just real quick, on the being able to reopen your case. I know that when they finished up with my case, the last thing that the attorney for the coal company wrote in there was that any time in the future, if your medical condition improves, we have the right to reopen the case.
And that's correct, but as most people in the room know, once minors are totally disabled, but yeah, they would try to latch on any piece of evidence that they think shows that if they thought they had a chance of reopening. But that's very rare.
What happens if a coal company goes out of business?
Well, it's an issue. Right now, if a company was self-insured, if they paid their own black lung benefits and didn't go out and buy a policy on the market, like you or I might buy car insurance or other types of insurance, if they don't have an active insurance policy with someone else and they're self-insured and go bankrupt, sort of like Westmoreland, I'm receiving letters right now from Westmoreland's former attorney saying that these cases are going to go into the trust fund. And we're seeing more and more of those cases go into a trust fund that's deeply in debt. But as of right now, the government has a responsibility for picking up those benefits. But it's an issue going forward that we need to address. Getting the excise tax back to its former level is at the same level for over 30 years. Had not increased in those 30 years. Even as other things, the price of everything else went up, that tax stayed the same. Well, now they've cut it by more than half to fund a trust fund that's already billions of dollars in debt. So in those cases, as of right now, benefits are covered. But we want to make sure they're covered forever.
So let's give our panelists a round of applause. And so now we're going to switch out just real quickly, and the second panel is going to come up on stage, and we'll keep on going.
Just say I'm with them. I mean, don't go into, I'm hoping to save time.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not going to, I'm just going to say, yeah.
Okay.
For a second here to get this. I just didn't want to show up on the screen.
I do not. Is Terry in the audience?
You keep the first one. Get rid of that one.
Yeah. Do you want to? Okay. Okay.
Keep these four. Keep that one. The next one. We're gonna get rid of.
Okay.
Get rid of that one. Delete. Delete. Gonna keep that one, and we're gonna delete everything else.
to take this off for right now since you're the last speaker. I'll minimize it. All right, are you ready? Okay. All right, we're going to get started with the second panel here. We've got 4 speakers for this second panel, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. Well, they're sitting in the order they're going to speak, so that makes it handy. First, we have Terry Ratliff, who is a former miner and mine inspector. Then we have Drew Harris, who is with UVA and is a pulmonologist and works with Stone Mountain Health Services. Next is Emily Sarver. She is a professor at Virginia Tech. And then Patricia Silvey is with MSHA. And just like with the previous panelists, I didn't mention this before, their bios are in your program, so if you want to read more about them, just look at your program. So we are going to be talking about the impact of rock dust on miners' health. And Terry, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you. First, I'd like to thank Stone Mountain for asking me to participate in this. I'm a patient with Stone Mountain. I had filed a claim in 2014 and was awarded a DOL award in 2017. It, of course, is still in litigation at this time. But I'm here today to represent the coal miners. I work presently as a safety analyst with the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. Been there for 26 years. However, the Department of Labor, they give me credit for 16 and a half years as a coal miner. So think about that. I've got 36 years working underground in the mining industry and credited with 16 and a half years. But I'd like to just talk to you from the coal miner's perspective, what we do as a coal miner. But starting out in the 70s, mid-70s, worked in mostly all small drift mines and truck mines, doing operating equipment, helping on roof bolt machines, shooting coal. Many of you guys in here probably come from that era of shooting coal. And of course, worked gradually as the continuous miners come on in the 80s, was then involved with that, operating equipment powered scoops, battery powered, cleaning, rock dusting, building stoppings, generally just all types of work underground. Later, I became a section foreman and worked with, of course, the conventional mining, handheld mining, drills and shooting coal, continuous mining methods, and later longwall mining systems. You have to excuse me, I'm a little nervous up here today. But anyhow, what I've seen over the years is the dust control is the biggest problem we have. And most of the miners, if you were early miners, you put your curtains up when the inspector came, you know, that's just the way it was. Then, and later on, you know, it started developing in the 90s and stuff, it got more stringent. Of course, during the mining process, producing coal, transporting coal in both underground and surface mines, you're exposed to dust, coal dust. So mine dust exposure is not only limited to the people working in the face producing coal. If you enter that mine, you're being exposed to mine coal dust. If you don't believe me, just go to a coal mine sometime, watch them come out. Their faces are black, their coal clothes are black with dust. So it's real prevalent. over the years, recently, we've got our mandatory dust samples. We have these personal dust monitors we're using. And it gives you a real-time display of your dust that you're being exposed to. But this is a good thing in some aspect. Of what you do day to day, because you're asked to do these samples, 5 consecutive days of samples. Okay, you as the employee, you're going to try to get the best sample you can. Your job may depend on it. It may take you off that matter if you've got poor samples, right? So you got the fear of retaliation that you may face. In a lot of small mines in the underground, you have to ride these 3-wheel buggies, things underground. So you're traveling on these roadways for great distances, sometimes a mile, 2 miles underground. And we've seen through sampling that the samples will spike when you're traveling in and out of the mines. You know, you'll see the spikes in those samples. Well, cold weather brings it on. Inside the mines, it dries out. So when it dries out. Other sources of dust that we're exposed to is from that face, getting that coal outside. So all your belt lines, all your transfer points, where that coal is dumped onto another belt. So that causes dust to be suspended in air. And those belt lines are generally in neutral or intake air courses that eventually get to the face, so that airborne dust can get to the face that way. Okay, another big problem is roof boulders. Roof boulders are exposed to silica. Silica dust is very harmful. What we sample for is coal mine dust and quartz. Well, quartz is a mineral that's in the rock that you're drilling the roof, okay? So if that may be minimal quartz levels, but if you're in sandstone roof or even shale or slate roof, you're dry drilling with the machine, you're exposed to that potentially exposed to silica, and we all know that's very harmful and can complicate the black lung. But in my experience, the demand for coal production is the reason our dust standards are not always met. Because you're in there to produce coal. If you don't produce coal, you're not going to be there very long. You know? So failing to maintain your dust control systems, even though the technology is out there and the law has made us do some of this stuff to put it in place, it has to be maintained. Well, if you take a cut of coal and you got a water spray system that needs to be cleaned periodically, maybe after every cut, if you're in there expected to get 10 cuts of coal that day, where are you going to have the time to clean those water sprays? It's not there. Now, again, we go back to the old inspector. When he's up there, you'll clean them, won't you? He'll see to it that you clean them. Anyhow, training the miners too to be our body position, where we're located in relation to the dust. And what I mean by that is working downwind of the continuous miner or the roof bolting machine. Normally it's a roof bolter is working downwind. So he's subject to all that dust that's coming. Now by law, he can only be there for one cut. But one cut's too much, in my opinion. He doesn't need to be there at all, downwind of that machine. We've noticed over the years, back years ago, We have more productive seams, higher coal seams, and that's changed. Now we've got thinner seams that we're mining. Of course, we've always mined these thinner seams, don't get me wrong. If you're more productive are gone. The seams that we have now, where we've got a thicker seam, say, we got a thicker seam, the coal seam may be 28 inches high. Our equipment is 40 inches high that we put in there. Well, we got to cut the top to make room clearance for the equipment. So you got a 28-inch coal seam and 67 inches of height to maintain that equipment. So there you are. How much rock are you cutting? That's a lot of rock, isn't it? Another thing we seen years ago when the miners come in, they started the remote control miners. Okay, with the remote control miners, immediately we went to deep cuts. Deep cuts, normally the cuts were 20 feet because you was on the deck of the miner. So it's very difficult to ventilate those. All those dust measures have to work in order to, it has to be maintained. I see I'm getting ready to finish up. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Terry. So I'm going to turn it over to Drew. Get out of here.
All right, I'll get right into it. I'm Drew Harris. I'm a pulmonologist at the University of Virginia. I am showing you here a couple of slides to start. This is work out of NIOSH. David Blackley and his group are showing the prevalence of coal workers' pneumoconiosis since the passage of the U.S. Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, which was 1969. That set dust limits in the mines and also set up the X-ray surveillance program. And you can see over the first 3 decades after this law was passed that the prevalence of black lung dropped dramatically. The graph on the left is the U.S. The graph in the center, B, is Central Appalachia. And you can see in the last 2 decades, this trend has totally reversed, and the prevalence of black lung is starting to increase back towards levels prior to the legislation being passed. And most of this disease is concentrated where we are in Central Appalachia. A different graph, this shows a map of the U.S. where you have the proportion of miners that have rapidly progressive disease, and the dark colors represent where you see more rapidly progressive disease, and it's really entirely concentrated around us here in Central Appalachia. This is important for a few reasons. The first is that we see this disease happening in younger miners with short mining tenures, and also folks who have spent the majority of their careers working after the Mine and Safety Act was passed with dust standards already in place. And the last map I'll show you is who's dying from black lung. And you can see here that in a good portion, over 95% of the country, nobody is dying from black lung, but lots of folks are dying around us here in Central Appalachia. And largely this is because of progressive massive fibrosis, or the most advanced stages of black lung. And there was a publication in the Journal of the American Association a year or so ago through work at Stone Mountain that showed this huge cluster of PMF around us here. So why is this resurgence of black lung and PMF happening has been sort of the topic of all of the meetings that I go to as a pulmonologist and the sort of center of the debate here. And there's a lot of different theories behind this, and one of which is the exposure to rock dust or exposure to silica. And I really like this article that came out of a mining engineering journal from a few years ago that says the easy coal of yesterday has already been mined. And so just as Terry was describing, that these large seams underground have already been accessed, and what's left are thinner seams surrounded by thick seams of rock that require folks being on their hands and knees for most of their careers here. Mining equipment is designed to mine coal, and it's less designed to mine rock. And so, as Terry was saying, if you're bringing in equipment that has to mine lots of rock above the coal seam, you're mining bits. So these are bits from a continuous mining machine, will get worn down. And then you're left with these duller bits that kind of grind the rock instead of cut it, and creates lots of rock dust that can easily overwhelm the ventilation and the scrubbers and sprayers that are designed to minimize this rock. And one more chart, and this is showing of the size of the height of mines, what percentage of it is actual rock being cut. So if you have a 10-foot high mine that you're walking into, how much of that is rock? And all these districts listed at the bottom are in the region around us in central Appalachia. Virginia is District 5. And you can see if there was a 10-foot mine, it'd be 2 or 3 feet of that would be rock that's being mined. And we've known that rock dust is dangerous, and we've known this for almost 100 years. And this is a picture of Hawk's Nest, which is in southern West Virginia. Shortly after the Great Depression, there were thousands of workers eager for work that went to work in this tunnel where they were blasting out sandstone rock to try to divert water from a river to an iron processing plant. And they ended up getting sick from breathing in these intense levels of rock dust, and over almost 1,000 patients died there, which they initially called tunnelitis because they weren't sure what this disease was, but we now know this was acute silicosis. And silica is something that we still see today in lots of different jobs in people who are manufacturing countertops or working with cement or masonry work, and including folks working in coal mines. They're all common professions that we see where this disease still happens. Silicosis is, like black lung, a hard diagnosis to make for us, and this often goes undiagnosed, underrecognized, underreported for lots of different reasons. One of which is there's usually a latency period from when you're exposed to the rock dust to when you develop disease. Certainly you can develop acute disease like at Hawk's Nest, but most of what we see is chronic disease with very non-specific symptoms, feeling short of breath, having a cough, feeling fatigue, non-specific pulmonary function testing, so you can see obstructive disease, restrictive disease. There's not really anything that's specific for silicosis. And the radiographs can look like cancer or sarcoidosis or histoplasmosis, and so it's hard to distinguish what the disease is just looking at a radiograph. And similar to PMF, there's no effective treatments here for silicosis. And this next slide is exactly the same, except it's for coal workers' pneumoconiosis, meaning it's often underdiagnosed and unrecognized. There's nonspecific symptoms, nonspecific lung function testing, nonspecific radiographs, and there's no effective treatment. There are some subtle differences. You see different shaped opacities on an X-ray, more associations with different infections with silicosis, but they're hard diseases to diagnose and to separate unless you take a really extensive occupational history. And most people like me who are lung doctors seeing patients who have worked in the mines don't know to ask the questions about how much rock was in the coal mines in which you were working. And so we assume if you were working in a coal mine for 10, 15, 20 years, that what you have is coal workers' pneumoconiosis, when in fact it could actually be silicosis because you're breathing in all this rock dust. And these are photos of case reports of miners who are all middle-aged males but presented with similar symptoms. And just looking at these radiographs, it would be impossible for me to tell you what diseases they have. And it turns out that even though they were coal workers, some of them had coal workers' pneumoconiosis, and another had silicosis, and some have mixed dust, which is a mix of silica and black lung. And it's hard to diagnose this with symptoms, to separate the two between symptoms and radiographs and pulmonary function testing. And our sort of pulmonary Bible that we all study in training combines these two diseases in one book chapter and says lung biopsy is rarely needed to establish the diagnosis. So we don't usually get lung biopsies. We don't usually get tissue to decide how to distinguish these two diseases. And I think it's challenging in the current era where we're now mining rock in coal mines to separate these diagnoses. And without tissue, we wouldn't be able to see things like this. And so this is a picture of a coal worker's lung that's looked under a special microscope called polarized light microscopy. And when you shine light at this coal miner's lungs, you can see bright white pigment, which is silica, and you can also see sort of browner or tanner colored pigments, which is the coal. And this person has mixed dust disease, but we would never know that without this lung tissue. And so I think the point of this panel at this moment is trying to figure out the role of how important rock dust is for this recent epidemic. And hopefully that question will be answered shortly through a large study that's looking at hundreds of miners, looking at the lung tissue that they've had, if they've had a lung transplant and gotten lung tissue or a biopsy because they weren't sure what was going on, and looking at those biopsies under a microscope to see what in fact they do see. And this is through work that Dr. Bob Cohen's doing in Chicago with Emily and a group of others here, to see what is the disease under a microscope. And as you can see in their sort of preliminary data, there is lots of silica, lots of mixed dust, meaning a mix of coal and rock. And so I think over the next year or so, we'll have a much larger population of miners where we can say, we know we're mining rock and we see this under the microscope. We have to implicate silica as an important part of this recent upswing in this epidemic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Emily.
Being a professor, I am well versed in the PowerPoint. Oops, I'm not that well versed. Okay. So I really want to thank Stone Mountain for having me here today, and I actually bring you greetings from Blacksburg from all of my students who are happy that I'm here today and not with them. So they asked that I do show you some PowerPoint and that I wore my new professor glasses, which my So with that, I just want to talk with you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing at Virginia Tech and follow up on some of the things that Terry and Drew had talked about. So this panel is, of course, about the effects of rock or mineral dust in coal mines, and that's what I've been studying for about 7 or 8 years now there at Virginia Tech. I just wanted to show you a little bit more data. So Drew showed you some nice data out of the NIOSH surveillance program there in Morgantown, and they've put out another paper quite recently, just in back in the spring, and it's an interesting paper. What they did is they took all of MSHA's dust monitoring data, which is basically the only dust data that we have historically, all comes from the monitoring program, which is for regulatory compliance, and what they looked at was total respirable dust, right? So total milligrams per meter cubed in the U.S. In general, and then in Appalachia. They looked at samples exceeding the quartz PEL, and quartz is basically our way of looking at silica, which we sort of recognize as maybe the most hazardous part of coal mine dust. And then they looked at the percentage of quartz in samples. And it's interesting what they saw is that, we actually have lower total dust levels on average here in Central Appalachia, and always have, versus the rest of the U.S. Meanwhile, we tend to have more quartz in Central Appalachia. And so this is really interesting data, and I think what a lot of people do is they look at this data and they say, well, quartz has to be the problem then, doesn't it? And certainly when we look at lung tissue, as Drew just showed you, we see the silica particles there, we see the quartz there, and so we say, well, quartz must be the problem. What I want to point out, though, is that I don't understand, though, how that explains the recent trend in PMF, and I think that's really the concerning point. So this is all of MSHA's data that I put together with just their quartz samples, and what this is showing is the exposure metric that we have to be interested in. So what's the concentration of silica or quartz in that dust? And what we see is that for the rest of the U.S. and for Central Appalachia, over 40 years, it's all been coming down, at least according to the monitoring data. So how does that explain the younger guys that we're seeing with this severely debilitating disease? And I think that's what keeps me up at night and what keeps me working on this problem is we need to understand that, and we need to understand it soon so that we can solve this problem. So I'll just maybe talk in circles here for just a moment about where I think some of the gaps in the knowledge. Basically, my job is to look for gaps in the knowledge and try to fill those in, and I'm fortunate to be in a position to do that. It's unfortunate that I'm doing that on this problem, which, frankly, we thought we had solved decades ago. So I do think that there are potentially some gaps in the monitoring data. We don't monitor all the time. We monitor for 2 specific metrics. So we monitor total respirable dust, milligrams per meter cubed, right? And we monitor how much quartz is in that dust. But we don't really look at anything else, and as I mentioned, we certainly don't monitor for quartz all the time. Quartz measurements, and those of you that have worked in coal or you're still working in coal, you know that we only do that quarterly. And so we have to use that data that we're getting to say, well, it's representative. And should we question that? Should we question how representative it is? We also monitor, and it's part of the regulation, that we try to do this under typical production conditions. And so what's happening when we're not producing coal, right? So Terry mentioned and Drew mentioned, right, we're mining these thin seams here in Central Appalachia. Frankly, from my knowledge, we've been doing that for decades, but we're doing it in a very unique way. I don't know anywhere else in the world that mines coal like we do here in Central Appalachia, which is to mine a seam this thick with the most powerful machinery that we can, right? And we developed that machinery in problematic, even though that doesn't show up in our monitoring data. So that's a real question that I have. This image here is just, it's kind of similar to what Drew just showed you. This is respirable coal mine dust that we've taken just in a filter sample, and we look at it under an electron microscope, which is fun in which we can actually look and say, how big are those particles, how are they shaped, what's the mineralogy, so what kind of particles are there. And lo and behold, when we do that, and I will say I'm very fortunate to work with a lot of industry partners across the US and now globally that welcome us to come and take samples in their mines. What we see is that, if you're working in a coal mine and you sample dust, you'd expect to see a whole lot of coal. We don't always see a whole lot of coal. We do always see a whole lot of mineral. Even in Western mines, like I'm showing right here, where they don't really need to cut that much rock, they still show a lot of mineral dust in that dust in their mines. And so that makes me question as an engineer, well, how are our dust controls really working? They're keeping the dust at a total level that's fine for compliance, but what's in that dust, and do we need to be concerned about it? What's the size of the dust, for instance, and do we need to be concerned about that? The other thing that I would say is this all kind of has to come back to what are our mining conditions. So again, we're talking about mining very thin seams here in Central App. We take a lot of rock with that, but how those conditions changed over time, and unfortunately that's a place where we just don't have really any good data. So, we don't get data from coal prep plants that say what's their yield been over the years. In fact, they're very reluctant to share that kind of data. But we need to understand things like that. We need to understand just, how powerful has this equipment become? What does that mean in terms of the dust characteristics, so that we can better target our dust controls, and we can have those work better for us. So I think that was really all I had for you, but I'm happy to answer any questions later. Is this one here? That's it, right? Okay, so you can either use the clicker there, or you can just advance it with that right there, okay?
After listening to everybody here, I've kind of to do that. But first, I would like to thank the Black Lung Clinics. I guess I should single out Stone Mountain because you are our host. But to all the Black Lung Clinics and what you do to protect miners' health, I want to say that we in MSHA appreciate that. I want to also thank and say to the miners that we appreciate what you do, and we appreciate you for being here. We unfortunately had another fatality last night. The newspapers get everything first, so I saw it when I woke up. I knew it last night, but I saw it when I woke up this morning. Unfortunately, in Madisonville, Kentucky, and today, 39-year-old miner, and today we are, praying for that miner's family. But before I get into the notes, I only have a couple of slides that I want to show. I do want to say that this is personal to me now, because I don't want to take but a minute, but I'm going to take a minute. because in 2017, my husband was diagnosed with lung cancer and actually lost over a third of his right lung. Now, I say that, and I'll get back to something Wes said, and he's a 100% disabled vet from Vietnam. He served in Vietnam. And the military had a presumption about certain medical conditions, and if you served in country, in combat, they gave you, and you subsequently ended up getting certain medical diseases. You got that presumption, and that's kind of what Wes was talking about. And that's what my husband got with respect to the lung cancer. However, I would say, and probably he would say were he here, that he'd rather not get that presumption and have had lung cancer. And I'm going to get to another point, because pulmonary function testing becomes very important also. And on that, I guess that's a segue. It didn't go in the order that I had planned, but that's a segue to where I'd like to start. And that is with something Senator Warner said in when you look at his opening statement in the program, that one of the things he stressed was that he worked, and I'm quoting now, successfully to pass legislation that requires a federal review of existing barriers to minor participation in federal health programs, and end quote. And I want to say to everybody that we do think minor participation is very important, because the medical surveillance is very important. Obviously, we know it is a progressive disease, but the earlier diagnosis becomes very important, because that's very important to treatment. We also know that there are some barriers to minor participation, and I was almost going to say mandatory minor participation, because right now we don't have mandatory minor participation. A couple of things I would also add is that with respect to MSHA's 2014 coal dust rule, we did have 2 new provisions in there that we hope are being fully implemented and fully taken advantage of to the extent possible. And as I say that, I know that in all areas it's not being fully implemented for a number of reasons, and that's the occupational history and full pulmonary function testing that we have to do in conjunction with NIOSH. Obviously, you all know because of the privacy issues. Now, for the most part, I'm talking to minors who have worked, but this is going prospectively to new minors, and hoping that with respect to minors working now, they're taking advantage of that. We all know, I think we'd all agree, I would be remiss if I stood here and said that I didn't agree with that quartz/silica, whichever you refer to it, is more toxic than regular coal dust. That is toxic. We know that, and in terms of the effect on the body. On that, we have MSHA has a request for information out now on silica quartz. I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail, but one of the things it will talk about is what is the appropriate pill. I think if I would ask you now, you would all give me the answer right now and say you don't even need to ask that. But the comment period now closes October 28th. We probably will have 3 public meetings, and I would say that I'd ask all of you all to participate, and particularly I'm talking to the black lung clinics and the people you serve. I said I have, and we do have, as you said, sir, we do have to pay attention to the places and the mines that present the greatest dust generation sources, and particularly for silica or quartz, whichever you want to refer to it as. I'm going to show, I think, if I can do this right, 3 slides. And and you may or may not, this presentation can be available to everybody. There are many more slides in here. But the only reason I want to do this, these are the samples of slides that are where the greater than 100 microgram of quartz. And you can see there that in terms of the sampling that we've taken, that they show, he's showing me this time period like I got to follow it, right? Yeah, I didn't even know that till I sat down here, that he was putting little things in front of you that says 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, but, you know. But I'm gonna go through. That show that the greatest exposures are in Central Appalachia. You can see where the clusters are. However, we find greater than 100 micrograms. You can see that in what we call our District 9 out west. I'm gonna give you a bit more information. Go to the next slide. This was 2018. I guess the other one was 2017. This is 2018. What does it do? It follows the same pattern. This is 2019. It follows the same pattern except for an outlier in Montana. And that's probably because we probably have one mine there in Montana. And the next one is a composite, fiscal 2014 to 2019. And they sort of follow the same pattern with exposures greater than 100 micrograms of quartz. Now, I talked about miner participation, and I fully understand retaliation because what do? We enforce that provision also, a miner discrimination complaint, and that there should be no retaliation if a miner either files a complaint or a benefit claim. Well, we have right now 90 active Part 90 miners, and that is miners who've exercised their right to work in a less dusty atmosphere. I think I did a composite number, and I don't see it right now, but I think I had it here, from 1995 until now, we've had a total of 490, if I'm not mistaken, miners who have filed for Part 90 status. I do have 409 for Part 90 from 1995 to right now. And we know, I'm sure, there are more miners who have evidence of pneumoconiosis. The next slide I'm going to go to is this one. And this one, of all things, is missing the district, the MSHA district, with the greatest number of samples. These were our greater than 100 micrograms quartz by district. The district with the greatest numbers, and you can see there you can see the percentages, is District 12, 44%. And you can see the other districts, followed by, you can see the percentages, 40% in District 7, MSHA's District 7, 30 District 4, but I kind of did a composite. And the states consistently come up, and they follow all the slides that we've seen. West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Alabama, but then you go out west, Utah, Colorado, Illinois. We got a few, Maryland, Ohio, and Indiana, and one each in Montana and New Mexico. Now, I show all that, and we say all we say, and obviously we have, and I should have introduced him. Tim Watkins here with me, who is the administrator for enforcement. We have, I know he's telling me to stop now. We have our inspectors every day out inspecting, and where we find overexposures, we deal with them every day. We discuss them in every staff meeting, and we look at the plan to see, obviously, every operator has to have a ventilation and dust control plan. We look at what revisions need to be done, more ventilation, what kind of controls, changes. So those are the things that we obviously know our work is not done, that we have more work to do, and there are some of the same questions that you all say, Emily, and you said you look at, we are looking at, and we have to look at those same questions, because whatever we do, we have to cause a reduction to this terrible disease, and we are going to work as hard as we can to do that. And like I said, this is personal to me. I did miss one thing, though, that Wes mentioned, and I'm just going to say that one last thing. And this is unfortunate, but that does get to presumptions, and it does get to evidence that you have to show. My husband did smoke. He served in Vietnam, but he smoked 55 years. So that gets to that confounding factor, but it also gets to the presumption that he was given to. But anyway, thank you all very much.
All right, so we're going to open it up for questions for the panelists. And while I'm looking out, I will ask, is there a risk going in and getting those biopsies? I mean, even, what, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the reason why they haven't been recommended in the past. And I think the challenge is, you know, if you're distinguishing silicosis versus black lung with a biopsy, the end result is we don't have a treatment for either of them, and so why would you subject the patient to that? But I think for the purposes of more epidemiologic data to try to end the epidemic, it's important to look at patients who already had biopsies. So if they had a transplant and they had their diseased lungs taken out, you can look at that tissue to see what kind of minerals are in there, what kind of dust was in there. Or if someone had a bad-looking CAT scan and got a biopsy because someone was concerned about lung cancer, that tissue is already available. And so there's not a real reason to biopsy to distinguish silicosis from black lung, but if other diagnoses, infections or cancers in the mix, you want to make sure that you identify that.
Thank you. Over here to Wes.
Just a couple things real quick. One thing I wanted to direct to Pat is something in Senator Warner's bill that he's co-sponsored, the Black Lung Benefits Improvement Act, would revive what's called the true doubt rule that we used to have in the system. And it's sort of like, you know, in baseball, tie goes to the runner. In the veterans, the VA system, if the evidence is equal and you can't determine whether the veteran is entitled or not, then the veteran gets the employer. That act would actually change that rule around. So if you had competing x-rays that the judge says, I can't determine which one I think is correct, the tie would go to the minor. But my question regarding this panel and the presentations, and I'm particularly thinking about the PowerPoint presentation before this one, you were showing essentially 40 years of data of samples that are showing less and less exposure over time. It's the graph's going like this. And yet we know in the last 20 years, the development of black lung in miners, especially in Central Appalachia, is doing this, and particularly with progressive massive fibrosis, it's kind of doing this. And I'm wondering how we could ever reconcile those two data sets and think that the samples have been representative. And especially when you think about other information that we have, such as, you know, documented history of when MSHA's not underground and sampling, and companies are sampling, that a lot of companies have been caught cheating on those samples. And anecdotally, I can say in our office, almost all of our miners can tell you, at least at one of their mines, how their company would cheat on their dust sampling. You know, whether it's hiding the pump, putting it in a lunch pail, putting it under clothing, taking it to the power center and clean air, or what have you. And so I guess I'm wondering, as a researcher, how can you go about dealing with that? And the fact that, you know, despite the data saying that minors are being less exposed, the disease is saying something totally different. And are the exposures much, much higher when MSHA's not on the ground?
So I don't think that I could say for sure. I don't think that I can answer your question for sure. I mean, it really is the case that we can't go back and sample, and it really is the case that there doesn't appear to be kind of a lot or inventory of historical dust samples even available that we could easily look at, although that's something that I continue to kind of try to pursue, particularly with NIOSH. You know, I think looking at the trends, even considering that, sure, I mean, let's just say, right, that at some point in, you know, over the past 40 years, there are bound to have been some operators that were cheating on their samples, right? And there may have been a lot. Has that really picked up in the last 25 years to explain the cases of really rapidly progressive severe disease that we're seeing in younger minors now? I think that's a question for me that I really question. Are they cheating that much more now? Or had they in the past, you know, 20 to 25 years? That's where I say, like, I'm not sure about that argument either. Would we see higher exposures? Probably. But would we still see the trend coming down? Probably. So that's where I really do question, you know, do we have different exposure conditions now that are really not picked up? They wouldn't be picked up even if we were sampling around the clock with the monitoring technology and the programs that we have now. So I certainly, I truly believe that there are a lot of different factors that have probably played into this. Unfortunately, from the historical data, we won't ever know that. But I think if we don't get a handle on the dust that's being generated and trying to target that now and understand what's in it, I'm afraid that even if we continue to improve culture in underground mines, that we still may see disease.
Something that, you know, these diseases, pulmonary diseases, and you know, when tuberculosis came out, everybody was concerned about contagious for one thing, which we know black lung is not. But after they heard, well, everybody was interested, is this going to be contagious to me? Then they just dismissed the It's a different public opinion when you see, but another dimension about black lung that I look at is the macrophages that the natural defense for the lungs is that they can fight off a lot of things by eating the pollutants and digesting them. But when it comes, the difference in black lung is they cannot digest. These macrophages can't digest rock dust and coal dust, and that makes a worse dimension about black lung than other lung diseases. That's something I'd like the whole country to understand and think about a little bit. You know, this is a more I'd like that people to think about that.
They didn't make it easy for me to get away.
It. Have you looked at the relationship of silica and black lung in relation to renal failure, kidney failures, increase in TB, and other diseases? Because I think there's a direct relationship between the two. At least the things I've studied say there's a direct relationship, a definite increase in kidney failures.
So I think that's a great question, and certainly both silica and black lung disease are associated with specific diseases. And so, for instance, different rheumatologic diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and scleroderma are ones associated with black lung and ones associated with silicosis. And lung cancer are more commonly seen with silicosis than with black lung. I don't know that there's more data than either of those two things that have been associated. I think it's good to think about other diseases that people might have so you can sort of get clued into what people have. But overall, the numbers of people that have rheumatoid with black lung are relatively small, and so it's hard for that to be a historical clue for sort of population level data just because those numbers are much smaller. But I think you're right to think about disease associations to help.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple of questions just to clarify some of the information we've been shown. My first question is, how is the overall respirable coal dust standard that we have adjusted for some of these 100 microgram per meter cubed quartz dust? I mean, is there some way of looking at what kinds of coal dust readings are coming in for the quarter, and then also accommodating for the fact that maybe that mine had a really high silica reading for that quarter? And my second question is with regard to the state of the monitoring technology. My understanding currently is that the continuous personal dust monitors are just taking a reading of total dust without differentiating the kind of dust. And so I'm wondering, and I know that they're not currently measuring quartz and silica, but I'm wondering what kinds of efforts are being put into developing samplers that can differentiate between maybe coal dust are likely more fibrogenic than other dusts.
I guess that's for me. And you know what? I'm sort of glad you asked part of that question because I missed part of what I was going to say. And right now, as you all know, our coal dust standard was reduced, but the way we deal with the greater than 100 micrograms of quartz is through further reduction in the coal dust standard. And so I sort of missed that part about mines that were placed on a reduced dust standard that we have now on a reduced dust standard. From the time period through June, the latest data I have, June 19th, 2019, we have, I didn't count the mines. So, here, yes, I did. 130, and we do that by reducing occupations. As you all know, you all who worked in the mine, the ODOs and the DOs, the occupations at the greatest risk. So we have, through August 21st, 2019, 92 occupations at 80 separate mines placed on a reduced dust standard. And that means the dust standard that we have, the 1.5, was further reduced because of some of the things I showed you, there's clusters that had greater than 100 micrograms of quartz. And in all the fiscal 2018, we had 169 occupations at 95 separate mines. So, quite honestly, because we are not through totally fiscal 2019 yet, until September 30th, that's sort of, the samples have gone down, but at the mines have not generally gone down. Now, in terms of differentiating, as you know, that continuous personal dust sampler, the CPDM, the one that we thought was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and gives a continuous readout. And I personally think that it goes a long way towards reduce tampering. Well, you can't tamper with the sample because the results are sent electronically to MSHA. It goes a long ways toward reducing cheating, any cheating. I'm not going to say an operator can't do it, but there are things in it where if the CPDM is moved, somehow the brain in it lets it know that it's moved from a dust generating source. I'm not the most IT literate person in the world, but that's sort of how it works. Now, what do I want to say? The issue left is that the continuous personal dust monitor, as you rightly said, samples for coal dust, and it cannot measure for the quartz. So MSHA does that. That can only be done by a gravimetric sampler and MSHA. That's only done by MSHA. And you didn't ask this question, but I'm going to go on and volunteer it. And to date, we have not been able to develop the continuous, like the continuous personal dust sampler for coal dust, the same type of device for sampling for quartz. NIOSH is in the process of trying to do it. We are working with NIOSH. NIOSH has developed something they call the rapid, the rapid quartz monitor or end of shift sampling device for quartz. But there are some infirmities related to it for using it as a compliance tool. And so what you do then, we are testing it with NIOSH in some mines. What you do is you continue to work on the sampling technology as best you can to a point that you can get to that point. As I look at things, and with my experience, I don't think we are going to be to that point for the next year or two.
All right, one more question, and then we'll thank our panelists and go to lunch.
My understanding, the OSHA, the limit is 50 micrograms. Why is coal mining at 100 and OSHA's half of that? And we have the additional problems of the coal dust to go with the silica.
That we have the request for information out for quartz, and one of the questions in there is that what should be the appropriate pail. The way we deal with it, as we have traditionally done, is further reducing the dust standard, which should further then reduce the quartz content. But that is a good question. And one of the things I will say, though, OSHA does allow in certain situations, not to one way or another, just factually, the use of personal protective equipment as a credit toward compliance. As you all know, MSHA does not allow in the coal mining situation. The operator can use, don't get me wrong, can use personal protective equipment, and we do recommend that if necessary, but not as a credit toward achieving MSHA's dust standard.
Two quick questions. I've been reading the data on the dust mask lawsuit, and not so much of getting the mining companies to admit that the dust mask companies developed inferior equipment, but I'm seeing a relationship between the amount of the seam of the coal is smaller than it was, and they're using more efficient equipment to get the coal, to extract the coal. Aren't we looking at a situation where PMF is going to mine greater amounts of silica in the lungs? And because if you look at the data of granite of stone workers in South Carolina, you look at them in Georgia, their silica dust is rising similar to the rate that we're seeing with PMF, with the amount of dust we're coming in. So aren't we looking at a situation where the PMF will peak, but the younger miners will have more dust, more rock dust in their system? What's going to happen to those miners? And that's my question.
Yeah, I think that's where we're all thinking similarly to that. And this sort of tissue pathology study will answer that question: is, are the folks who have had PMF in this modern era, is it really silicosis or mixed dust? And I think what's happening, but it will be good to have some data to tell us for sure.
Okay, I've got one more. I'm gonna go rogue here.
Okay. You know, MSHA provides us with the x-rays for coal miners. And am I hearing that an x-ray doesn't necessarily detect black lung in that itself? In other words, if they send me a record that says you're clean, is that necessarily accurate? That's one. And I'll give you some information everybody's been talking about, is that today's coal coming into preparation plants, it's not uncommon for it to be 70% rock. That is sort of a standard. That is 70% rock. And I have one more thing. You're talking about silica, and that, you know, we're talking about the lung today, but explosion will kill you quicker than black lung. And you see them hauling tons of rock dust in a mine and spraying it down for dust control. And does that have silica? And if it does, do we need to change that?
So the rock dust has no silica. I mean, the dust that you put on to get rid of the dust, the rock dust does not have silica in it. It's like a commercially produced product. The answer to the X-ray question, so black lung and X-rays is complicated in that you can have COPD or emphysema with a normal looking X-ray but still qualify for benefits from black lung just from COPD from the dust exposure. Typically what you'll see is sort of round nodules in the upper parts of the lungs, but you can see all different things with black lung and an X-ray. I think it's an important part of the overall piece, but certainly the pulmonary evaluation for sure.
All right, I'm going to turn it over. Y'all, let's thank our panelists. And I'm sure that, as with the others, they'll be around for you to ask questions and talk to.
Thank you. So we've got lunch out in the foyer here. There are two sides of the table, so please use both sides. Get your lunch and come back in. We're going to be starting our keynote with Howard Burkus from NPR at 12:30. So please take a break, get lunch, and come on back in.
Where'd you work?
I am very honored and pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Howard Burkus. He is originally from Pennsylvania, but has lived in Utah for the past 40 years. He has been, or he was with NPR, National Public Radio, for 38 years and just retired. Since 2010, he became involved in investigative journalism. And just kind of a fun fact that he shared with me, he has covered 8 Olympic Games over his career. So I'm going to turn it over to Howard.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Don't have to applaud. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, so you can still eat while I'm doing it. I'm here because NPR and PBS Frontline produced a film about this epidemic of progressive massive fibrosis. And that's something we came to do. We worked on it for over a year. The film came out in January. In December, NPR had some stories on the radio. It's a more extensive series than the film. I would encourage you to go to npr.org, listen to the radio story, look at the web story, because it does deal with some issues that the film doesn't. But what we tried to do was we asked a basic question. How could this happen? How could there be these numbers of minors with progressive massive fibrosis in this day and age if the regulatory system that was designed to protect them had worked the way it should? And so that's what we tried to look at in this film. I started working on coal mine related issues in 2010. I spent a year investigating the Upper Big Branch mine disaster in West Virginia, looking at the regulatory failures that occurred before that mine disaster, and looking at the failures of the mining company to take care of its miners. And that got me interested in workplace safety and coal mine safety regulation. And so most of the investigative reporting I've done since 2010 has been focused on workplace safety and on regulatory agencies and whether or not they're doing what they're supposed to be doing to protect workers. I also spent more than a year working on a series of stories about workers' compensation and how states around the country have changed the workers' compensation system. But through that, I kept returning to black lung. In 2012, with Chris Hamby of the Center for Public Integrity, we reported the resurgence of black lung disease. In 2016, I came back and was the first to report these clusters of disease of progressive massive fibrosis, which are the biggest clusters of that disease that have ever been reported. And that's when I asked this question, how could this happen? And so I returned to that starting in late 2017 and started working on the investigation that ended up in this film that was on PBS Frontline. So let's take a look at the film. It's about a half hour long. When the film is done, I'll give you an update on what's happened since the film aired, and also take some questions.
I've mowed that bank right there since I was a little boy. Lord, 8 or 9 years old. It's just a simple task to most people, but to me, this is something that's like a challenge that you have to get through. I believe fully if I hadn't really got up and started moving around because I was so sick, I would have sat in my chair and died. And things like this right here, I get up and it gives me, I motivate myself to do it.
During the past 6 years, I've been in and out of the coal fields of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania, meeting sick and dying coal miners. At first, I reported for NPR the resurgence of a deadly coal mining disease, black lung, which had been declining for decades. Then I got a tip 2 years ago about an outbreak of the most advanced form of black lung disease, and I began looking into why it was happening.
So this morning we're headed to visit with Danny Smith. He's a young guy. He's younger than what you'd expect for somebody to be so sick with this disease. So you said you had a rough time last night?
Yeah, I sleep in my chair, but
So you sleep out here in the living room in a
Most
chair?
of the time, I sleep in a recliner. Yeah.
Danny Smith is just 47 years old. He mined coal only 12 years, but he's desperately sick.
Are you ready, Sissy? Yeah. Well, let Dave turn his oxygen off, and I'll get my stuff ready, and we'll go. I started getting shortness of breath around 2007, 2006. I could tell a difference in just the things that I was doing around here.
You want me to get this?
The oxygen, yeah, I need it. And in 2012, I believe it was, they'd done a CT scan, and they seen all the spots on my lungs. They said, it's black lung. You're eat up with black lung. They put me in a hospital. I had 30-some pounds of fluid on me, on my lungs. I'm not feeling good today, baby. Didn't sleep good. I was scared. It was tough on all of us because my wife was scared that I was dying, and I was scared that I was dying, and I was. Can you turn that oxygen on back there? Just pull that little green handle. Just pull it like towards you. There we go. Now I gotta get it on my face. I think about all the hours that I worked. I was under one mine. I never come outside for 4 days. I actually slept underground. And you sit and think about that and all the things that I give up with my family. You know, I work in anywhere from 12 to 18 hours a day. I'm dying over it now, you know what I'm saying? I love you. Give me a kiss.
As I met more miners like Danny Smith, it became clear that they were getting this advanced black lung disease younger and more quickly than in the past.
Greg.
Hey.
I'm Howard Burkus from National Public Radio. Great to meet you.
Greg Kelly is just 54 years old, still relatively young for a miner so sick.
That's me, and that's my stepdad.
How long did you spend in mining?
31 years. Here's one. That was in 83.
And what made you stop mining?
My health. I just couldn't. I got sick, and they said, we don't want you to go back to work till you see a lung doctor. When I did get to see him, he said, you know, you don't need to go back underground.
Was that the first time you learned that you had black lung?
Right. Yeah, that's the first doctor that ever said, you know, you've got black lung. I've had 2 or 3 X-ray technicians tell me they're the worst set of lungs they've ever seen.
What kind of reaction did you have when you heard about that?
You can't work. Well, it's just like a light switch. You turn it on, and turn it off. All your plans that you had, you know, hunting and fishing and doing what you want to do when that day comes. Well, all of a sudden it's here and you can't, you don't have the air to do it. You know, I still enjoy life and have a good time, get to play with my grandson, just not like I want to and like I used to be able to, you know. You catch one? There he is. You got it. I just try to pray and ask the Lord to help me to overcome it. That leaf right there. And just go on and be with my family. You got one, didn't you? Well, the whole time I've been over, I can't breathe. And then when you raise up, you got to just stand still to get your breath. Well, come on, let's go show Mom what you caught.
It was kind of rough because I was in Texas when a lot of it first happened, being, you know, pretty far away from home. And Caden, he had to adjust with when he first brought oxygen home or whatever, Caden asked, when's he going to get better? When's he going to be able to go out and play like we used to? And that's what we had to tell him, it never will change, it'd be the same.
That's the worst
Won't get no better.
That's probably been the hardest ordeal in my grandson.
The disease that steals the breath of coal miners is back with a vengeance.
Across Appalachia, I met dozens of other miners with this advanced black lung disease and started reporting their stories.
Basic black lung diagnoses doubled in the last decade. Advanced disease quadrupled since the 1980s in Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky.
1 in 5 working coal miners in Appalachia could have diseased lungs. That's true for the thousands who've been tested, and it could be the rate for the rest. The more I reported, the more it became clear it was worse than anyone realized. Go see Brandon Crum in Kentucky, I was told. He's a radiologist whose clinic is overwhelmed with cases of advanced black lung disease known as progressive massive fibrosis, or PMF.
So if I show you for comparison, this is a normal x-ray. And you can see all the dark area, that's the lung, because it's filled with air. And you contrast that to this one. See all these big wide areas all the way through here. That's all conglomerate fibrotic mass, or PMF. The biggest concern at that time for me was seeing young men my age, and I'm 43 or younger than I am, with the most severe form of the disease, which is the complicated black lung disease.
Crum was so concerned he took his findings to researchers at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH.
So what happened 2 years ago in terms of you sitting down with people from NIOSH?
Well, when I told them, we were seeing, or I was seeing, a lot of complicated black lung disease, and what was most concerning is I was seeing it in individuals in their 30s and 40s. I think there was some hesitancy on their part. I'm not sure they believe me.
He told us that he was seeing a lot of really advanced disease, and it was concerning to him. And I guess my initial thought was, that's probably not true.
The researchers had been tracking black lung disease themselves for decades, but they only tested working miners, not those out of work, and hadn't detected the sharp rise in deadly PMF that Brandon Crum was finding.
He invited us to show us some of the medical images from his patients, and we sat there for an entire day, one after another, looking at these chest x-rays, the worst I've ever seen.
What was your reaction to what you saw?
Horror, shock. I don't know how many other words to use. I was really taken aback, not only that these cases were legitimate, but just how severe they were. It indicated that we had a huge problem, and we realized immediately that it wasn't going to be isolated to a single clinic.
Researchers at NIOSH had only reported 99 cases of PMF in the previous 5 years. But out-of-work miners had been flooding clinics, and in calls and visits to 16 clinics across Appalachia, Frontline and NPR identified close to 2,000 cases in the same time frame. The Stone Mountain clinics in southwestern Virginia reported more cases than anyone. Ron Carson directed the clinic at the time.
We're going to put you in a room. Come on with me. Well, NIOSH reported maybe 90 or 100 x-rays.
All right, if you'll step up there real close for me.
So we came back and we started doing a study on how many we actually had, pulling x-rays back to 2014 to 2017, 3 years of x-rays. We quickly identified 416 during that 3-year period. However, if we had went back to 2010 at a minimum, we could have probably doubled that.
The breathing in and out, deep and fast. In and out. And stop.
And I don't know what your test will reveal today, And I tell everybody this for almost 30 years, don't get discouraged.
But the count here at Stone Mountain is now nearly 800, with a dozen new cases a month.
My buddy here. Okay. God bless you, my
Thank you,
friend.
darling. God bless you.
I just think that America needs to know that these miners, they have paid a price. So many years these miners extract this coal so that you and I can dairy. I'm sorry. They paid a price. They have paid a price so that we can have luxury. And I just feel like America has just forgotten about them.
Hurry a second.
So let us trust in you and you only. Despite what's going on around us, give us the joy and the peace that the world cannot give us. And we thank you for your love that is unconditional. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
With no cure, Danny Smith finds some help with his breathing at a pulmonary rehab clinic. Miners come here as much as 4 days a week, and they're monitored closely.
Marcy, can I drop down
Yes.
today?
Yes, you
I'm
can,
wore
honey.
out.
What's Danny's heart rate? 96. Let's stop and catch our breath there for a second. Danny, when he first started with us, he would break out in a cold sweat, literally drenched, and he would start shallow breathing. Depression, anxiety, you know, that is as much a part of this disease as their breathing is. And we're going to turn it way down, okay?
All right. See, that feels pretty good right there.
It takes them approximately 3 to 6 months to build up when they start this program. At 6 months, they're typically maxed out. If they're out for 2 weeks, they lose pretty much everything they gained. Once they go
And if I
into...
miss 1 or 2 visits, I could tell it. I mean, it's affected me.
You did it. 10 minutes?
I got it.
These men, literally, if they go home and they sit down, they've got about 6 months to live.
If I hadn't started here, I'd already been
He
dead.
would have. I believe that too. I do.
I love y'all. Y'all my angels. See y'all.
This morning, I got up at 4:30
When people get the first stages of the disease, they require oxygen, and then even the oxygen that you're adding to that person so that they can do more isn't enough. And so they're essentially suffocating while alive. Something seemed to change where people were more heavily exposed to perhaps more toxic dust and were getting this very severe form of the disease that from my medical school training and from my past clinical practice was rare. We didn't see that many cases of PMF, and it was something that we thought had been relegated to the trash heap of history.
The modern era of coal mine regulation began nearly 50 years ago, in part because 40,000 coal miners staged a wildcat strike in West Virginia, demanding government action on black lung.
The greatest heroes are you, the coal miners. You've taken the future, your future in your hands, and you proclaim, no longer are we going to live and work and die like animals. We're free men.
Congress responded with a tough new law that was supposed to protect miners from the coal mine dust that poisons lungs. And in the early 70s, a new federal research agency, NIOSH, began to monitor black lung disease among working miners.
We saw a nice reduction in the rates of disease falling down to very low levels. And then that, I call it the U-shaped curve of concern. The curve went down and hit the bottom and then started to go back up again, meaning that something changed. We took our eye off the ball, something else happened, and the disease was recurring.
What changed was mining itself. Big and pure coal seams were mined out. Thinner seams embedded in rock were left. Mining machines cut more and more of that rock, producing fine and sharp particles of quartz or silica, toxic dust that the existing mining regulations didn't directly control.
Somewhere in the late 20th century, there has been a change in the composition of the dust. We're seeing more silica, and silica is 20 times more toxic than coal. When you inhale silica, it's retained in the lung. These miners are inhaling their workplace, and it stays with them forever.
By the mid-1990s, federal regulators knew there was a problem. NIOSH recommended new silica regulation, including an exposure limit twice as tough, but the proposals didn't go anywhere.
So you worked for the agency back in this time frame. Why didn't the agency respond to this?
There was a lot of reluctance, both in the mining industry and I think also from the mine workers union about what they would call complexity of really doing both a coal mine dust standard and a silica standard. Now we see in miners who were, again, working at that period of time and now are the ones that are seriously ill from that disease.
They're dying.
Yeah.
Terrible deaths.
Yeah. Had we taken action at that time, I really believe that we would not be seeing the disease that we're seeing now.
It wasn't until 2014 that the Mine Safety and Health Administration, MSHA, put in place new restrictions on coal mine dust. But again, something was missing.
This is the new dust rules that took effect in 2014. What's interesting is this section here where MSHA said it wasn't establishing a new limit for quartz or silica.
Instead of imposing specific new limits on silica dust, regulators continued to rely on rules that control coal mine dust overall, and a complex formula to measure exposure that dates back decades. We decided to see if this approach had really worked, using MSHA's own data.
This is the formula that is actually still in use. And what our data shows, what MSHA's data shows, is that that formula hasn't worked 9,000 times since 1986. We can see it in the data. It's kind of puzzling why they didn't see it in the data and why they don't think this is important enough to have a different kind of regulatory process.
We do have a new respirable dust rule. I say it's new. It's 2014.
Greg Meikle is responsible for coal miners' health at MSHA. I sought interviews with him and other agency officials for months without any success, until this annual West Virginia Black Lung Conference.
Greg, I'm Howard Burkus from NPR and PBS Frontline.
I have not met you.
We have not met, but I've wanted to talk to you, and I'm going to take advantage of that right now. You said that you need to establish an incident rate before you can respond as a regulatory agency. What do you mean exactly?
Well, the incident rate is how many miners, if we have no miners that are diseased, then the protections are effective.
Well, you have lots of miners with disease, so that means the protections are ineffective?
We've got a new rule. The old rule, we had some problems, and that's why we went to the new rule.
The new rule doesn't measure separately for silica. That's what's still in place. That was what was in place in the old rule. And we have thousands of miners who have progressive massive fibrosis. Doesn't that need to be changed? If the problem here is silica, don't you need to separately regulate silica?
Well, in the preamble to the new rule, it said that quartz was not being addressed.
In the new rules, MSHA officials cited research that said coal mine dust was the main factor in black lung and PMF. And they continue to stand by that idea that limiting coal dust overall protects miners from excessive exposure to silica. As for the coal mining industry, it once proposed focused regulation of silica, but mining companies continue to cut thin seams and create toxic silica dust.
We sympathize with those individuals, with those families. If we could turn back the hands of time, we would do so to prevent this. But, we can't. We're dealing with historic exposures. And from our perspective, what we need to be focused on today is how do we prevent a reoccurrence of this?
You've talked about the idea of looking ahead, but what we see as we look at data of exposures, and it shows that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of exposures, not 30 and 40 years ago, but also 20 and 10 years ago. And the industry knew that mines were cutting more and more rock, which was creating the silica. Why didn't the industry recognize what was going on and do something about it when it was taking place?
Well, I don't think it's entirely fair to say that the industry didn't recognize and didn't do anything. For a long period of time, we've been pleading, and I'll use that word, we've been pleading with the agency to allow us to use non-traditional controls for dust control.
You can slow down the mining machines. You can maybe cut production a little bit so that you're not generating as much dust. Or maybe you decide that you don't cut so much rock and you don't cut those thinner seams. Aren't those things that mining companies could have done? You don't need regulation to do that.
Sure, they could have done that. But again, Howard, I'm not going to speculate on why they did or didn't do what they chose. Our focus here is forward-looking. How do we prevent this in the future? I can't answer for what occurred in the past. Were we really focusing on the right thing? MSHA had a mantra, end black lung, and we support that. But coal dust might not have really been where the focus should have been at that time. It might have been silica rather than coal dust.
For months, I'd been trying to talk to the head of MSHA about the PMF epidemic and the agency's decisions to not directly address silica.
The MSHA mission is to prevent death, illness, and injury from mining and promote safe and healthful workplaces for U.S. miners. A very honorable mission.
David Zeteslo is a former mining company executive who runs the agency. In September, we tracked him to a rare public appearance here at West Virginia University.
Silica is toxic to your body. You hear the phrase in health circles of progressive, massive fibrosis, these sorts of things. To me, I believe those are all clearly silica problems. Silica is something that has to be controlled.
I was surprised that Tesla was so clearly connecting PMF to silica and wanted to know why this hadn't translated into direct action.
Mr. Zeteslo, I'm Howard Burkus from National Public Radio and PBS Frontline. We've been interested in talking to you about progressive massive fibrosis and the epidemic of disease. I'm wondering why you're unwilling to speak with us about that. We've had multiple requests for interviews, ready to talk to you today, next week, in the past.
I don't think the science is that well defined on it yet, Howard.
You have 2,000 miners right now with
I don't think that the science of the causation is that well defined. I don't know.
You said yourself that silica was...
No, I said I suspect silica.
We've interviewed dozens of coal miners, and they've told us about their experiences. They all have progressive massive fibrosis. They're all dying from this disease. So they've talked about their experiences.
I'm supposed to go up here to this picture.
Why won't you talk to us about this issue?
Why?
Because I don't think the science is settled on.
What has that got to do with it? You have so much experience in this field, as you just described, and you described all these deaths that are occurring.
Okay, let me put it this way. I won't talk to you about it because I'm supposed to go be in a picture right now.
Excuse me, students are waiting for secretary, please.
One of the things that just makes me angry is there's such a lack of urgency in the agency. It's abundantly clear in what we're seeing. This problem really is a silica problem. And it's really why we're seeing such severe disease in miners. So we know the problem is silica dust, yet that's not what we're protecting miners against. Or our effort to protect them is utterly inadequate. I mean, I don't know how you can reach any other conclusion. And that is, I mean, this is such a gross and frank example of regulatory failure.
Given the time it takes for disease to appear, it could be a decade or more before we know whether the new coal mine dust rules have made any difference. In the meantime, there are still more than 50,000 coal miners working nationwide. When you come back here, do you feel, pride or
I was a young man and I was making good money. To sit back and look at it now, they kind of molded us the way that they wanted to mold us, buying us nice t-shirts and tools and hats all the time and all this trips and stuff like that. It wasn't worth it, because and the bonuses and all that stuff. And we all worked our long hours and forsake our families for it. It's tough. We was all young men. We were just kids. But we worked hard. We killed ourselves here. We have a family cemetery. And when you already got your plot picked out, at my age, that's kind of a scary thought, I hope one day I get to see my grandchildren. I don't want to talk more, okay? I'm sorry. Just give me a minute. I'm all right. If I can see my babies graduate from college, both of them.
For more on this and other Frontline programs, visit our website at pbs.org/frontline. Frontline's Coal's Deadly Dust and Targeting Yemen are available on Amazon.
Her brother still mines coal. Her cousin still mine coal. I think the fact that she was involved in this film helped give it some sense of reality. And she was also really easily able to talk to coal miners she spoke their language, she knew their lives, and I think that really helped to get miners to trust us. We talked to more than 34 coal miners for this investigation that we did. We featured 2 in the film. We interviewed systematically 34 miners, talked to them about their work histories, and we have actually, it's kind of like a case series that medical researchers do to try to understand the causes of a particular medical condition or disease outbreak. And we've published an analysis of the results of those interviews on our website at npr.org, and I'd encourage you to go take a look at that. Because as we've seen here today, the miners who are here today, when they start talking about what they experienced, sometimes it doesn't jive with what the researchers are telling us about what they think is going on, or what even the regulators are saying about what is going on. A really good example of that, and we weren't able to address it in the film, but we did in our radio stories, is slope mining or development mining, where miners would spend months on end digging through solid rock to get to a seam of coal. The sickest miners who I've interviewed, and the youngest, all did that. Danny Smith spent months working 16-hour days. Sometimes he'd work 7 days a week because it was really important to the company to get from one coal seam to another, digging a slope mine. That's probably where his greatest exposure occurred and could maybe explain his disease. He's not the only miner I've talked to who's had that experience. And what we learned as we went through mine safety law and regulations is that there is no requirement for testing for dust when you're doing development work or slope mining, because you're not mining coal. And so you have a situation where some of the greatest exposures that miners are experiencing is also a situation that is not as regulated. Something else that I touched on in the film that we talked about more in the radio story and on the web are the results of our analysis of 30 years of MSHA's sampling data, where they sampled for quartz or silica. And we acquired that data and we analyzed it. As was pointed out earlier, NIOSH actually did something similar after we did it, and their results are consistent with ours. They actually found it was worse than what we found. They had a broader set of data that they were able to look at. And we found over 21,000 samples showed excessive silica in that 30 years. Now, that represents thousands and thousands and thousands of exposures to dangerous levels of silica. And of course, they're only sampling, as was pointed out, a fraction of the time. So there could have been greater exposures. And as people have pointed out today, the mines were in the best conditions when inspectors are there. The curtains are hung up, as was pointed out. The miners we spoke with, miner after miner, told us about how the mines were the cleanest. They would even slow down production so they'd get better sampling when inspectors were on site. We've heard about the fraud that has occurred. That's not just anecdotal. There were crackdowns on dust sampling fraud in the 1990s, major crackdowns on that, and there's a prosecution underway right now, indictments just last year in Kentucky for dust sampling fraud. And so there was a lot of exposure that went on, despite a regulatory system that was supposed to prevent that exposure. And the key element of that system, which is supposed to control the exposure to silica dust, does so indirectly. And when we looked at those dust samples, we found that even after there was a reduction in the coal dust standard to account for excessive silica, there were still more than 9,000 excessive exposures to silica, or excessive measures of silica, even after there was a reduced coal dust standard, which leads you to believe that it's not a one-to-one relationship, and that reducing the amount of coal dust in the mine doesn't necessarily reduce the amount of silica to a safe level. That has yet to be addressed. This is mentioned in the request for information that MSHA has just issued. There's a discussion before the specific questions that MSHA asks in that RFI, and this is mentioned, this formula, and it's also mentioned the idea of reducing or toughening the silica standard. As you've heard today, there's no direct measurement of silica in the regulation, and then there's no direct response to excessive silica. It's done through lowering coal dust, the coal dust limit. I think the analysis we did and that MSHA also did shows that doesn't work a significant amount of time, so that needs to be looked at. In the request for information, that is discussed, but the questions that are posed, that are asked, this is what we want to hear about, focus more on permitting those alternative compliance tools that Bruce Watsman alluded to, which is allowing dust masks to be used, for example, for compliance, other kinds of technology that could be brought to mining. And there's nothing wrong with the idea, of course, of doing anything to keep miners safe. Absolutely. But that bumps up against the law, which says that the primary means of controlling dust in a mine is through keeping the mine clean of dirty air as much as possible, water sprays and ventilation. And the fear is that if you allow companies to comply by, say, providing masks or helmets that are in use in some places, what companies will do then is not clear the air like they're supposed to, and rely instead on masks and other means of technology. And of course, we've seen what's happened with dust masks. There are dozens and dozens of lawsuits right now. There have been a couple of mega-million-dollar verdicts against the companies that produce and provide dust masks. And Danny, in fact, is one of the people who has a lawsuit pending over the failure of dust masks to protect them. And as was pointed out earlier, it's hard to work in those things. Every miner will tell you that. So somewhere in there, maybe there is a solution, but it doesn't appear to be pointed toward what I think our investigation clearly shows, which is that the formula for controlling exposure to silica dust doesn't quite get there, or at least it works 85% of the time in the data we looked at, which is a great number, 85%. But that other 15% represents thousands and thousands and thousands of instances in which there was too much silica in the air that miners were breathing. A couple of other things that have happened since our documentary aired and since our reporting, our investigation was published. There was a congressional hearing, a House subcommittee. The chair of that committee, Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia, has promised to develop legislation. We haven't seen that yet, but he's promised to develop legislation that directly addresses this. And you heard Dr. Cohen in there talk about the U-shaped curve of concern, which is showing this rise in progressive massive fibrosis. Well, he has since referred to that as a J-shaped curve of concern, because the occurrence of disease now exceeds what has been historically known. And we're talking about progressive massive fibrosis. There were slides earlier too that showed some other relatively new studies out. One new study shows that there are certain opacities in the lungs that are signatures of silica in particular. And there were studies of of the X-rays that NIOSH has gathered over the last 30 years or so, and they went back and looked at them again, and they were finding that now there are more and more of these particular kinds of opacities that are associated specifically with silica in the lungs of miners that they've been testing more recently. That's one of the new studies, and there are other studies underway. Emily Sarver talked about the studies that she's involved in with Dr. Cohen. NIOSH has a number of studies underway. There is an attempt to, as Emily said, to look at what really is causing this. Are there other things that haven't been understood or are clear? But the strong sense that silica is the problem is something that is currently not addressed in the regulatory structure that exists. And just see if there's, and the other thing, Emily Sarver, I think, asked, that really critical question of how, we need to learn more to find out what's really causing this. You have what appears to be a drop in the number of samples that have excessive silica in them while disease is going up. And of course, there's a latency period there. But we also know that the sampling process, as was stated, only captures a fraction of the exposure that takes place, and that mine inspectors are only in mines, a fraction of the time. So that sampling may not actually give us a reflection of what is occurring. And I can't tell you how many roof bolters have told me, and roof bolters are among the people who are most affected by this epidemic, who have told me about things that aren't quite picked up in the sampling process, like when they're cleaning out the dust box, and they have this system that collects the dust while they're roof bolting, but then they got to go clean out the dust box, and they open it up, they get a spurt of exposure. And miner after miner told us about these episodes of high exposure that occurred when the drill bit first goes in to the roof if you're roof bolting. And people mentioned working downwind of the continuous mining machine, that there are instances where there are bursts of exposure to dust, to silica dust, that are not necessarily picked up in the sampling. So there are these fundamental questions that are still left unanswered, and one of them is, what kind of regulatory response will there actually be? How long will it take for there to be one? Will it directly address silica? Will it address this formula that doesn't appear to work enough of the time? Will there be a regulatory response in time before we have another generation of miners with progressive massive fibrosis? And will Congress act? Which I think is a really key question. If Congress changes hands next year and there's a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House, then the Republicans have shown no appetite for more regulation. The Republicans from coal mining states have not been championing any direct action on this issue. So maybe if Congress changes, but I need to note that the epidemic that we're seeing now is a result of failure to act in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And after the Upper Big Branch mine disaster in West Virginia, the House was Democratic, the Senate was Democratic, the White House was Democratic for at least a year or so, and there was no direct action after that. The regulatory agency took action. MSHA took action and instituted a number of things that it did administratively to crack down on mine safety that was effective. But there was nothing from Congress that made it through. There were laws, there was something key law introduced, but nothing made it through. In any case, that's me on my soapbox. I'm happy to take questions. or if, yeah, over here there's one. Oh, yeah.
Online?
So the documentary is online at frontlinepbs.org. And then the NPR radio stories, which, by the way, one of the things we did when we interviewed those 34 miners, we actually have some pieces that are just the miners talking about their experiences with dust masks, their experiences with exposure while they were working, and also how the disease has affected them and their families and their lives. It's some of the most heart-wrenching interviews I think you'll ever hear. That's at npr.org, the NPR website, as well as some web stories, and we have our data published there as well.
Any
question over here?
Where? Vonda?
I was glad to see that story, and you were talking. My husband was diagnosed at 47. He actually helped put 3 slopes in, and the last slope that he put in was over at McClure, and that's when his health really went down. So I can relate to this story because my husband was 47 when he was diagnosed, and I do agree. I think it had to do with a lot of the slopes because they actually had to go in and use the dynamite to get through the rock. There was a lot of rock they had to go through, and this man worked 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, whatever made the company happy.
How many years to dig that slope mine?
How long did it take? 3? 2 or 3 years for the last one.
2 or 3 years, so that's every day.
7 days a week,
Cutting through rock,
hours.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of somebody spending that much time, 2 or 3 years. Of the 34 miners that we interviewed in detail, there were 3 or 4 of them who talked about their slope mining experiences. I don't know how common it is. I don't know if there's data on that. We asked, as you saw in the film, we tried to get MSHA to talk to us and got nowhere. But I think that's something that needs to be looked at.
I do too, because actually when they were putting the slope in, they couldn't have, there was no dust monitors, they wasn't allowed. And I think that with the regulatory things that needs to be done, I don't care if you're putting in a slope, I don't care what you're doing. I think there needs to be regulations, things need to be looked at all times, because they weren't allowed in there. They were in there and they had to get this done. They had a timeline. And I think it's the company pushing the men to get what they need done to get the coal out. And I think it's more about the money than it is about the health of the miners.
One more question. Has anyone compared hard rock mining, developing tunnels and things of that nature to see how dust has been generated, how they control that, and how that might
I'm sorry, I didn't
mining?
catch it.
Has anyone checked on tunneling operation or hard rock miners to see how they are varying with the silica versus coal mining?
The data that we looked at, we focused on coal, but hard rock miners are also exposed to dust. The data that we looked at showed that it wasn't as much of a apparent exposure. However, it is a problem with surface miners. This is not just an underground mining thing. And a number of the miners we spoke with had only ever worked on the surface. And so you think you're in the open air, but there's quite a bit of dust. Truck drivers talk to us about how if the windshield broke on the truck or the door didn't close all the way, or the air conditioning didn't work and you had to open your windows, the cab would fill with dust and you'd be in dust all the time. And it was rock, because on the surface you're cutting through rock to get to the coal. I know that NIOSH is doing more work on surface miners and surface mining with disease, surface miners with disease and surface mining.
Hello, my name's Andy Martin. I used to work a strip mine, running a drag line. You know, they dump like 80 cubic yards of dirt at a time. I went back for a retirement party. I couldn't believe how many guys has got the same stuff I got. Bunch of them on oxygen already. I was diagnosed just like him at 47 years old. And I was just wondering if anyone done any studies on them drag lines to see what kind of dust they're putting out, because it's a bunch.
I know that there's that NIOSH is particularly interested in spending more time looking at surface mines and looking at the impacts of mining there. But we definitely, you know, we know certainly anecdotally that, you know, just run across a lot of surface miners with disease. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you for doing this piece, because when you have moved from an area where you've been mining, people don't understand the impact this has on your life. And I can't believe how many people saw this and had a better understanding of how lives change. So I just wanted to thank you for putting this out in the public and caring enough for people. So thanks.
Well, thank you for saying that. You know, I've reported in my career all over the country and overseas, and we've seen, especially in the last 4 years, reporters parachuting into Appalachia and doing stories often tied to politics. But I think one thing I learned starting with covering Upper Big Branch is that coal mining and coal miners and their families in this region are not very well understood outside this region, are demonized to some degree. And I just felt it was important when I was working on Upper Big Branch. I think what really surprised me was this idea that you could, I mean, it's naive, but you could go to work and not know whether, you know, you'd go home alive. And coal miners, like every other worker in this country, deserve to go to work and go home healthy and alive. I mean, that's simple as it is. And I know that, you know, I know the regulators are committed to that. I've met a lot of really good people at MSHA, inspectors, and at the district level, and that's, you know, that is their mission too. Sometimes getting there in a political environment can be tough. I understand that. I understand that things didn't happen 20 years ago when this was well understood. This is something else we didn't talk about in the film, but we do in the other stories, is that, you know, we got documents from the agency from 20 years ago. There was a recognition of a cluster of what they called silicosis at the time. It's progressive massive fibrosis in coal miners, and they tied it directly to exposure to silica. They made that connection, the agency did, and even sent out a warning to the mining industry. This is happening. Do something about the exposure to rock. This happened in 1995. A year later, a Labor Department advisory committee recommended making the silica limit twice as tough and directly regulating silica. That was 1996. Nothing that we're talking about today is new. 20 years ago that this was recognized. It was a difficult political environment 20 years ago to try to get anything done. And at that time, the agency itself was under attack. There was a move to disband it and make it a part of OSHA. And so, you know, the people who were running the agency had that to deal with, and they weren't able to get this done. Sure.
Has there been a comparison study done for the people who work primarily in the tunneling, like you're talking about the slope tunneling, opposed to those that never did work on, you know, they just worked underground, but they were in the face or whatever? Has there been a study done to show the difference in the lung damage? Do you know of any that's been done?
I don't know. Lung damage by occupation. Except that you can look at where the exposures occurred by occupation, and you can see for roof bolters and continuous miner operators, you can look at the kind of excessive samples, excessive dust that they might have been exposed to. But I don't know. I know there's a lot of interest in research in looking at the looking at lung tissue, looking at autopsies when they're available, looking at biopsies, and trying to see whether, as Emily Sarver mentioned, there are other minerals that are involved and that sort of thing. But I don't know that anybody's looking at by occupation if there is some kind of different signature.
I really think a lot of this blame can go back to some of the coal companies and the operators too, for pressure for production for the almighty dollar. I think that's contributed to a lot of these problems that we're talking about and seeing happening, in my opinion.
Well, you know, the employer has both a legal and moral duty to protect the health and safety of their employees. And it's up to the regulators to make sure they do it. And it's up to the rest of us to, if there's something going on that we think isn't right, to say something about it, I suppose. And to try to, you know, to talk to our members of Congress. And it's great to see the organization that occurs among the Black Lung Associations and them pulling together people and that sort of thing. But I know from the reaction we got from this film that people, our listeners, we have millions of listeners and viewers around the country, were pretty horrified that this kind of thing is going on in this century in the United States of America. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Let's give Howard a round of applause.
Yeah, thank you.
And so I'd just like to thank everybody for staying all day and coming out. I know it was beneficial. We had some great panelists sharing some important information. And I'm going to point out Margie Toman again with Stone Mountain's Black Lung Clinics. If you have any questions at all, please talk to Margie. She's a good contact for everybody. And then you heard from Brad earlier, so seek those folks out. Thanks, you all. Have a good evening. All right.